He rarely raised his voice, but when his carriers moved, entire oceans listened. In a war defined by distance, speed, and timing, measured in minutes, Marc A. Mitscher commanded the most powerful striking force ever assembled at sea. He did not seek attention, he did not cultivate legend, and yet, again and again, the decisive blows of the Pacific War followed the wake of his carriers. Mitscher fought the war from the horizon. Naval warfare had changed completely by the time the United States entered the Second World War. Battleships no longer decided outcomes alone. Control of the sky, and the ability to project power hundreds of miles from a moving deck, now defined victory. That transformation demanded a new kind of commander, one who understood aviation not as support, but as the battlefield itself. Mitscher was that commander. And he had been a naval aviator before aviation mattered. He understood aircraft, pilots, and the fragile balance between aggression and preservation long before the war demanded it. When the moment came, he did not have to adapt. He simply applied what he already knew. Early in the war, he was there when risk outweighed certainty. He commanded the carrier that launched the Doolittle Raid, a mission that made little tactical sense and immense strategic impact. It was dangerous, improvised, and nearly cost his ship. Mitscher executed it without hesitation, understanding that morale and momentum mattered as much as damage inflicted. As the war escalated, so did his responsibility. Mitscher took command of fast carrier task forces that ranged across the Pacific with unprecedented freedom. His fleets did not wait for the enemy to appear. They hunted him. Islands were not just invaded. They were isolated, softened, and rendered irrelevant before troops ever landed. Under Mitscher, carrier warfare became systematic. Strikes launched at extreme range. Fighter screens layered defense in depth. Recovery operations were timed with precision that left no margin for error. He protected his pilots fiercely, understanding that experience was irreplaceable. He accepted criticism when it meant saving lives. He withdrew when objectives were achieved, refusing to gamble men for spectacle. At battles like the Philippine Sea, his carriers broke the enemy's air power permanently. Japanese naval aviation did not recover, not because of one dramatic engagement, but because Mitscher's task forces destroyed its ability to fight coherently at all. And yet, Mitscher was never reckless. He knew when to strike hard. He knew when to hold position. And most importantly, he knew when enough was enough. When pilots returned at dusk, low on fuel, uncertain of landing options, Mitscher made one of the most human decisions of the war, ordering lights turned on across his carriers, risking enemy detection to save lives. It was not a tactical calculation. It was leadership. By the later stages of the war, Mitscher commanded power on a scale no admiral before him had ever controlled. Entire island chains were neutralized from the air. Enemy fleets were forced to react rather than plan. The Pacific became a domain where American carriers moved freely, relentlessly. Mitscher did not just win battles. He defined how modern naval war would be fought. The history of Admiral Marc Mitscher is not one of speeches or symbolism. It is a story of trust between commander and pilot, of judgment applied under impossible pressure, of restraint when destruction was available but unnecessary. He reminds us that the most decisive leaders are often the quietest, and that in war, the ability to think clearly can be more powerful than any weapon. Tonight, we follow that path across the Pacific, from early risk to overwhelming dominance, from fragile decks to unstoppable task forces, from a war learned in motion to a victory secured at range. This is the complete history of Admiral Marc Mitscher, Annapolis, Maryland, June 1910. A young midshipman named Marc Andrew Mitscher stood in formation awaiting his graduation ranking, knowing what was coming would sting. When the announcement came, his name landed near the bottom, 113th out of 131 graduates. Around him, an honor students celebrated their future commands, their prestigious assignments, their place in naval history. Mitscher remained silent, his thin face expressionless, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the ceremony. He had survived 4 years at the Naval Academy, not through academic brilliance, but through stubborn persistence, an ability to endure what others found unbearable. No one that day could have imagined this mediocre student would one day revolutionize naval warfare itself. The United States Navy of 1910 represented 2 centuries of tradition, all of it centered on one weapon, the battleship. These floating fortresses, bristling with massive guns, dominated every strategic calculation, every budget debate, every admiral's imagination. The largest battleships displaced 30,000 tons, mounted 12-inch guns that could hurl shells 20 miles, and symbolized national power in ways nothing else could match. Young officers dreamed of commanding battleships, of standing on those mighty bridges, of wielding that awesome firepower. Naval doctrine held these truths as self-evident. Battles would be decided by gun duels between opposing battle lines. Victory would go to whoever built the biggest ships with the heaviest armor, and the side with numerical superiority in battleships would control the seas. Into this world of certainty and tradition, a handful of eccentrics were introducing something the establishment viewed with contempt: the airplane. Mitscher's early assignments offered little promise. After graduation, he served on various surface ships, watching officers with better academic records advance past him. And he remained characteristically silent, speaking only when necessary, earning a reputation that followed him throughout his career. "Talks like he's wired for sound," his colleagues said. But in 1915, something shifted. The Navy had begun experimenting with aviation, and few respectable officers wanted any part of it. Aviation meant leaving real ships for canvas and wood contraptions that crashed regularly, killed pilots with disturbing frequency, and offered no clear path to advancement. It was a career dead end, a backwater for misfits and dreamers. Mitscher volunteered immediately. Pensacola Naval Air Station, Florida, June 1916. Mitscher earned his wings as Naval Aviator number 33, entering a world so small that every naval aviator in existence could fit in a single room. Only 38 naval aviators existed when Mitscher qualified, operating aircraft so primitive they were essentially motorized kites. The training itself was brutally simple. Watch someone fly, then try it yourself. And if you survived your crashes, you learned. No sophisticated curriculum existed, no established doctrine, no career path beyond the immediate challenge of not dying. The aircraft themselves, fragile biplanes with unreliable engines, inspired more terror than confidence. Yet Mitscher felt something his battleship years had never provided, a sense that he was witnessing the beginning of something that would matter, even if no one else believed it yet. May the 1919. The war in Europe had ended, and the Navy sought to demonstrate aviation's potential with a spectacular achievement: the first transatlantic flight. The 3 Navy Curtiss flying boats, designated NC-1, NC-3, and NC-4, would attempt the crossing from Newfoundland to Portugal with stops in the Azores. Mitscher served as co-pilot aboard NC-1, one of dozens of crew members who had spent months preparing for this moment. The aircraft were massive for their time, with wingspans of 126 feet, yet they carried barely enough fuel for the journey. On May 16th, all 3 aircraft departed Newfoundland in formation, heading into darkness over the Atlantic. The flight itself was a nightmare. Storms, navigation failures, mechanical problems that forced constant adjustments. 400 miles from the Azores, NC-1's engines began failing. Mitscher and his crew ditched in the open ocean, bobbing in rough seas until a ship rescued them. They had flown 1,200 miles, farther than most people believed possible, but NC-4 completed the journey and claimed the glory. Once again, Mitscher had come close to something historic but finished as a footnote. The 1920s were wilderness years for naval aviation. Peace brought massive budget cuts, and the Navy channeled what little money remained toward battleships and cruisers. The entire naval aviation budget for some years fell below $1 million, roughly 1% of total naval appropriations. Officers who might have considered aviation saw their cautious peers advancing, while aviation advocates languished in forgotten posts. Mitscher endured a series of desk assignments in Washington, bureaucratic positions that taught him nothing except how slowly institutions change. Whereas he watched the Navy build new battleships, invest in fire control systems for those battleships, develop tactics for battleship engagements, all while aviation remained a curiosity. But throughout these years, Mitscher maintained his flight proficiency, logging hours whenever possible, staying current even when it seemed pointless. In 1927, Mitscher received orders that would shape his understanding of carrier operations. Assignment to USS Langley, the Navy's first aircraft carrier. The Langley had been converted from a collier, a coal transport ship, giving it a strange, ungainly appearance that earned it the nickname Covered Wagon. Its flight deck measured 540 feet, barely adequate for the aircraft of the day. More critically, the ship could launch only 12 aircraft and required 20 minutes between launches while the deck was cleared and another aircraft positioned. The entire operation was improvised, dangerous, and inefficient. Pilots approached landings with genuine fear, knowing the deck was too short and the arresting gear primitive. Crashes were common, sometimes fatal, always spectacular. Yet Mitscher spent hours on that deck, watching, learning, understanding the fundamental challenge: how to pack maximum striking power into limited deck space and launch it quickly enough to matter in combat. What Mitscher saw aboard Langley was possibility wrapped in chaos. Every carrier operation revealed new problems. How do you coordinate multiple aircraft when radio communication is unreliable? How do you find your own ship after a strike when navigation is uncertain? How do you land aircraft rapidly enough to recover a strike group before they run out of fuel? How do you protect the carrier itself from enemy aircraft when fighters must also escort your own bombers? These weren't abstract questions. They were life and death puzzles that someone would eventually solve, and whoever solved them first would own the future of naval warfare. The battleship admirals saw only the problems, the inefficiency, the expense. Mitscher saw a weapon system that didn't exist yet, but could, if someone figured out the missing pieces. Throughout the 1930s, Mitscher continued his quiet observation and learning. He attended the Naval War College, where he participated in war games that repeatedly demonstrated carrier effectiveness, all only to watch senior officers dismiss the results as unrealistic. He commanded patrol squadrons, served in staff positions, always returning to the same conclusion: naval aviation could revolutionize warfare, but only if the Navy gave it adequate resources and someone willing to challenge 2 centuries of tradition. By 1940, with war spreading across Europe and Asia, the Navy finally began serious carrier construction. Mitscher, now a captain, received orders to commission and command a new ship, USS Hornet, one of the most advanced carriers ever designed. At age 54, having spent 30 years in a Navy that barely tolerated aviation, Mitscher was finally getting a chance to prove what he had always believed. December 7, 1941, changed everything. When Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, destroying or damaging 8 battleships in a single morning, the old Navy died with them. In 2 hours, carrier aviation proved what 2 decades of argument had failed to establish. Aircraft, not guns, now ruled naval warfare. The battleship admirals had been wrong about everything, but victory required more than being right. It required commanders who understood how to wield this new weapon, officers who had spent years thinking about carrier operations when no one else cared. The Navy needed commanders who could coordinate multiple carriers, launch hundreds of aircraft simultaneously, sustain operations for weeks at sea, all while inventing doctrine in real time under combat conditions. The Navy needed Marc Mitscher, the mediocre student who graduated near the bottom of his class, the junior officer dismissed to aviation's backwater, the quiet man who watched and learned while others advanced. He was about to become exactly what the moment demanded. Newport, Rhode Island, spring 1933. The Naval War College's game room hummed with tension as junior officers moved miniature ship models across a massive table representing the Pacific Ocean. The scenario was provocative: enemy carriers launching strikes against Pearl Harbor, while American battleships attempted defense. Hour by hour, the game unfolded, and the results shocked everyone except the aviation advocates who had designed it. The carrier aircraft destroyed most of the defending battleships before they could close to gun range. The implications were clear, revolutionary, and completely unacceptable to the admirals observing. Within hours, as senior officers declared the exercise unrealistic, noting that the game rules had been rigged to favor aviation. The game designer, a frustrated commander, tried explaining that the rules simply reflected what aircraft could actually do, but no one wanted to hear it. The report was filed, forgotten, and the battleship construction program continued unchanged. The 1930s represented a fundamental clash between evidence and belief. The Navy conducted annual fleet problems, massive war games involving dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft, and carriers won repeatedly. Fleet Problem 9 in 1929 saw carrier aircraft sink the Panama Canal locks, potentially isolating the Pacific Fleet. Fleet Problem 13 in 1932 demonstrated that carriers could achieve surprise through speed and range, and Fleet Problem 19 in 1938 showed coordinated multi-carrier strikes overwhelming any defense. Each time, the results were explained away. The weather had been unrealistic, the defenders had been unlucky, the umpires had been biased. The pattern was consistent. When reality contradicted doctrine, reality was dismissed. Meanwhile, Congress continued funding battleships because admirals requested battleships, and admirals requested battleships because they had spent their careers on battleships. The system reinforced itself perfectly, but a small group of aviation fanatics refused to give up. They were called the Bomber Mafia, the Aviation Lobby, the Carrier Clique, always with condescension, always implying they were zealots disconnected from reality. Men like Admiral William Moffett, who had commanded USS Mississippi before converting to aviation, argued that aircraft would render battleships obsolete within a generation. Lieutenant Commander John Towers, one of the Navy's first aviators, developed tactical concepts for massed carrier strikes. These officers faced constant resistance from the Gun Club, the battleship establishment that controlled promotions, assignments, and budgets. At the Pearl Harbor Officers Club in 1935, a violent argument erupted between battleship and carrier officers, nearly coming to blows, requiring the base commander to intervene. The argument was never about tactics or technology. It was about identity, status, and which group would control the Navy's future. The numbers told a damning story. In 1940, the Navy had 3 admirals for every carrier admiral, and reflecting where power and prestige actually resided, budget allocations were even more skewed. Congress approved 2 new Iowa-class battleships in 1940, each costing $110 million, while carrier construction lagged despite being far cheaper. An Essex-class carrier cost $68 million and could launch 100 aircraft. A battleship cost more and could hit targets only 20 miles away. The math was obvious, but mathematics couldn't compete with tradition. Officers who advocated too loudly for aviation found their careers stalling. The message was clear. You could believe in carriers, but you had better not believe too publicly. And you certainly shouldn't suggest carriers might replace battleships. Yet, tactical innovations continued among the believers. Aviation officers developed the concept of deck load strike, launching every available aircraft simultaneously to create overwhelming attack mass. They experimented with fighter sweep tactics, sending fighters ahead of bombers to destroy enemy aircraft on the ground. They worked on radar-directed fighter interception, coordinating defensive fighters from the carrier using primitive radio equipment. They created specialized aircraft for different roles: torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, scouts. All of this happened in the shadows, unofficial doctrine developed by junior officers because senior officers refused to consider it. When war came, these innovations would prove decisive, but in the late 1930s, they existed only in classified reports and informal discussions among the converted. San Diego, California. October 1940. Captain Marc Mitscher stood on the pier, watching USS Hornet slide down the shipyard ways. The carrier displaced 20,000 tons, measured 800 feet long, and represented every lesson learned from earlier carriers. Its flight deck could accommodate 90 aircraft. Its elevators could move aircraft from hangar to deck in minutes rather than the half-hour required on older carriers. Its island structure was positioned to maximize deck space while providing excellent visibility for flight operations. Its fuel capacity allowed operations for 90 days without replenishment. Mitscher had spent months working with designers, incorporating his decades of carrier experience into the ship's layout. Now he would command this beautiful weapon, ease assuming she survived commissioning and shakedown, without some admiral deciding carriers were still reconnaissance assets. The period between Hornet's commissioning and Pearl Harbor revealed the full extent of the Navy's confusion about carrier doctrine. Mitscher drilled his crew relentlessly, practicing launch and recovery until they could get all aircraft airborne in under an hour. He coordinated with other carrier commanders, developing ad hoc communications protocols since no official doctrine existed. He pushed his pilots hard, knowing they would need every hour of training when war came. But official orders still treated carriers as auxiliaries to the battleship fleet. War plans called for carriers to scout for the battle line, provide anti-submarine patrols, and support the battleship's advance. The concept of independent carrier task forces didn't officially exist. Carriers were expensive, fragile, and therefore had to be protected rather than used aggressively. Mitscher read these operational plans with growing frustration, knowing they were obsolete before they were written. Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, annihilated 2 decades of doctrine in 2 hours. The fact that Japanese carriers had achieved what American war games repeatedly predicted, that aircraft could destroy battleships at anchor, vindicated every aviation advocate's argument. But vindication came at a terrible price. 8 battleships damaged or destroyed, nearly 2,400 Americans dead. The Pacific Fleet's battle line shattered. Suddenly, carriers weren't auxiliaries anymore. They were the only capital ships the Navy had left. In overnight, carrier commanders went from supporting cast to leading role, expected to defend an ocean with ships their superiors had barely trusted months earlier. The pressure was enormous, the stakes total, and the learning curve nearly vertical. The Navy needed carrier doctrine immediately, but doctrine takes years to develop, and Japan was already advancing across the Pacific. The first months of war exposed how unprepared American carrier commanders were for independent operations. At the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, American and Japanese carrier forces fought the first naval battle in history, where opposing ships never sighted each other. Everything depended on aircraft. The Americans stopped the Japanese advance but lost USS Lexington, a devastating blow when the Navy had only 3 operational carriers remaining. At midway in June, American carriers achieved a stunning victory, sinking 4 Japanese carriers. But coordination problems plagued the American effort. Hornet's strike group got lost and never found the enemy, a navigation failure Mitscher glossed over in his report. Victory at Midway proved carriers could win wars, but it also revealed massive deficiencies in training, coordination, and leadership. By late 1942, the Navy faced a crisis. It was winning the carrier war but losing carrier commanders. Some were killed in action, but more were simply relieved for insufficient aggressiveness or poor judgment or inadequate performance. The truth was simpler. Most commanders had spent their careers on battleships and couldn't adapt to carrier warfare's complexity and speed. Admiral King, the chief of naval operations, began systematically replacing cautious commanders with aggressive ones, but the pool of qualified officers was dangerously shallow. Every relief sent a message: succeed immediately or be replaced. The pressure created a culture of aggression that sometimes bordered on recklessness, but King believed boldness was better than hesitation. What the Navy needed were commanders who understood carriers instinctively, who had spent their careers thinking about carrier operations, who could coordinate complex strikes while remaining calm under pressure. What the Navy needed, in other words, were the aviation fanatics the gun club had tried to suppress for 2 decades. Their moment had finally arrived. San Francisco Bay, April 2nd, 1942. 16 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers sat chained to USS Hornet's flight deck, their olive-drab fuselages gleaming in the morning fog. Sailors stared at these massive Army bombers occupying space meant for Navy aircraft, wondering what insane mission would require launching land-based bombers from a carrier. The B-25s were not small aircraft. They weighed 30,000 pounds fully loaded, required 467 feet for takeoff from a runway, and Hornet's deck was only 800 feet long. No margin for error existed. Worse, These bombers would never land on Hornet again. This was a one-way mission, and every man aboard knew it, though no one knew the target. Captain Marc Mitscher stood on the bridge, watching Army Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle supervise the loading, and allowed himself something rare: hope. If this worked, America would strike back at Japan. If it failed, 16 bombers and 80 men would die for nothing. The mission's concept was audacious, bordering on suicidal. Doolittle, a famous racing pilot, had convinced the Army Air Forces that B-25s could launch from a carrier deck if stripped of unnecessary weight and loaded with extra fuel tanks. The Navy, desperate for any way to strike Japan after Pearl Harbor, agreed to provide the carrier. The target was Tokyo itself, a raid that would deliver minimal military damage but enormous psychological impact. America needed to prove it could reach Japan, that Pearl Harbor would be avenged, that the war was far from over. Mitscher understood the strategic calculation, even if he questioned the tactical wisdom. A-16 bombers against the Japanese home islands was barely a pinprick, but sometimes symbolism mattered more than tonnage. His job was simple: get Hornet within 400 miles of Japan undetected, launch the bombers, and escape before Japanese forces counterattacked. The task force departed San Francisco on April 2nd and rendezvoused with Enterprise's group on April 13th in the North Pacific. Together, the two carriers and their escorts raced toward Japan at 20 knots, maintaining strict radio silence. For 5 days, the ships plowed through rough seas, while Doolittle's crews practiced short takeoffs, and Mitscher's staff refined the operational plan. The designated launch point was 450 miles east of Tokyo, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough for the bombers to reach China after striking Japan. When everything depended on surprise. Japanese patrol aircraft could force an abort if they spotted the task force, and Japanese carriers could turn Hornet into a flaming wreck if they caught her loading bombers instead of fighters. Mitscher prowled the flag bridge constantly, chain-smoking camels, watching the horizon, calculating distances and fuel consumption and risk. April 18th, 1942, 8:20 in the morning. The radio squawked urgently. Enemy surface craft sighted. A Japanese patrol boat sat on the horizon, exactly where it shouldn't be. Mitscher and Doolittle faced an immediate decision. Launch now, 650 miles from Japan, too far for the bombers to reach their Chinese landing zones safely, or abort, turn back, and accept that months of planning had failed because of one patrol boat. And Mitscher studied the situation for 30 seconds, then said 3 words: "Get 'em off." Within minutes, Enterprise's aircraft sank the patrol boat, but the damage was done. The boat had transmitted a warning before going under. Japan now knew American carriers were approaching. Speed became everything. On Hornet's pitching deck, Army crews scrambled into their bombers, while Navy deck handlers positioned the first B-25 for launch. Doolittle would lead. If the mission commander wouldn't take the risk, no one else should. At 08:20, Doolittle's bomber roared down the deck, sailors holding their breath as the aircraft staggered into the air with barely 50 feet of deck remaining. One by one, the other bombers followed, each takeoff a minor miracle of physics and courage. By 09:20, all 16 bombers were airborne, heading west toward Japan, while Hornet turned east, running for her life at maximum speed. Mitscher watched the bombers disappear into the horizon and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Whatever happened next, America had just struck back. Around noon, Tokyo time, Doolittle's bombers roared over Japan's capital. Air raid sirens wailed, the first time most Japanese had ever heard them in their own country. The bombers dropped their payloads on factories, military installations, and symbolic targets. Damage was minimal. A few buildings destroyed, some fires started, perhaps 50 people killed. Military impact was negligible, but psychological impact was total. The Japanese government had promised its people that divine wind would protect the homeland from foreign attack, yet that the emperor's realm was inviolable. Now, American bombers flew over Tokyo in broad daylight, unopposed, proving that promise was a lie. Japanese military leaders reacted with fury and fear. If 16 bombers could reach Tokyo, what would come next? The Japanese High Command immediately began recalling fighter units from Pacific operations to defend the home islands, dispersing forces that might have been concentrated against Allied positions. For the bomber crews, escape proved far more dangerous than the attack. Launching 650 miles out instead of 450 meant none of the aircraft could reach their designated landing fields. Doolittle and his men flew toward China as their fuel gauges dropped toward empty. Most crews bailed out over Chinese territory, trusting parachutes and luck. And one crew landed in Soviet territory and was interned. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces in China, 3 were executed, 1 died in captivity, and 4 endured years of brutal imprisonment. 11 crews survived through various combinations of skill and fortune, aided by Chinese civilians who risked their lives hiding American airmen from Japanese troops. Out of 80 crew members, 71 eventually returned to Allied control. The mission had been expensive, 16 bombers destroyed, 8 men dead or imprisoned. But the strategic impact justified the cost. When Hornet arrived at Pearl Harbor on April 25th, Mitscher discovered he was famous. The Doolittle Raid dominated every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every conversation. That President Roosevelt told reporters the bombers had flown from Shangri-La, refusing to reveal the carrier's role, but military personnel knew the truth. Mitscher, who had spent 30 years as an unknown captain in an unfashionable specialty, suddenly found himself celebrated as the man who struck back at Japan. Admirals who had dismissed carrier aviation now sent congratulatory messages. Politicians who had questioned carrier spending now demanded more carriers immediately. The Navy brass who had spent decades suppressing aviation advocates now embraced carriers as the weapon that would win the Pacific War. Mitscher accepted the praise with his usual terseness, speaking only when absolutely necessary, but privately he understood what had changed. He had proven carriers could project power offensively, not just defend reactively. The implications would reshape everything. The Doolittle Raid's true significance emerged over the following months. Japan's decision to recall fighters for homeland defense weakened their position in the South Pacific. More critically, the raid convinced Japanese leaders they needed to extend their defensive perimeter farther east to prevent future carrier strikes, a decision that led directly to the Battle of Midway. At Midway in June, the Japanese Navy committed 4 fleet carriers to a campaign designed to eliminate American carrier forces before they could threaten Japan again. The resulting battle destroyed those 4 Japanese carriers and killed hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. Japan's carrier aviation never recovered. All of this traced back to April 18th. And when Mitscher said, "Get 'em off," and launched a mission everyone said was impossible. The mediocre student who graduated near the bottom of his class had just helped change the course of the Pacific War, and he was only getting started. Coral Sea, May 8th, 1942. USS Lexington burned with fires her crew couldn't control, smoke billowing thousands of feet into the tropical sky. Internal explosions racked the carrier as fuel vapors ignited deep within her hull, turning the ship into a floating bomb. Her crew fought desperately to save her, damage control teams flooding magazines, firefighters advancing into infernos, medics treating burned men on the deck. But the physics were against them. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the captain ordered abandon ship. Sailors slid down lines into the warm sea while destroyers circled, plucking survivors from the water. At 7:52, a destroyer fired torpedoes into the derelict carrier, sending her to the bottom before Japanese forces could claim the prize. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been a strategic victory. American carriers stopped a Japanese advance toward Australia, but the cost was enormous. The United States Navy now had only 3 operational fleet carriers remaining to defend the entire Pacific Ocean. This was carrier warfare's brutal arithmetic, radically different from anything naval officers had experienced. A battleship could absorb dozens of shell hits and survive. A carrier hit by a single bomb or torpedo could become a helpless wreck within hours. The ships were floating aviation fuel depots, packed with volatile gasoline, armed ordnance, oxygen systems for high-altitude flight, all of it waiting to explode if something penetrated the flight deck. Worse, carrier combat happened at ranges where opposing ships never saw each other. Admirals made life or death decisions based on incomplete intelligence, launching strikes at coordinates that might contain enemy carriers or might be empty ocean. The stress was unlike anything battleship commanders had faced. There were no visual confirmations, no ranging shots to correct aim, no second chances if the first strike missed. Launch your aircraft at the wrong coordinates and they might run out of fuel searching. Hold your aircraft too long and the enemy might strike first. The margin between victory and catastrophe measured in minutes and miles. June 4th, 1942. The Battle of Midway. The Navy's three remaining carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, East and Yorktown, faced four Japanese fleet carriers in what everyone understood might be the Pacific War's decisive engagement. Marc Mitscher commanded Hornet and led her strike groups on missions that would haunt him for months afterward. His torpedo squadron flew directly into Japanese defenses and was annihilated. Every aircraft shot down, every crew killed, without landing a single torpedo hit. His dive bomber group, led by Commander Stanhope Ring, flew the wrong heading and never found the Japanese fleet. Hornet's strike achieved nothing, while Enterprise's and Yorktown's aircraft won the battle, sinking 3 Japanese carriers. Mitscher's after-action report carefully glossed over the navigation failures, emphasizing Hornet's aircraft did attack Japanese ships eventually, after hours of searching, but senior officers noticed. But Mitscher's command performance at Midway had been problematic at best. The period from June through October 1942 became known as the Graveyard of Admirals among Navy insiders. Carrier commanders were expected to be aggressive but not reckless, cautious but not timid, willing to risk their ship but not waste it. The contradictions were impossible to navigate. Admiral King, watching from Washington, relieved multiple carrier commanders for insufficient aggressiveness, a catch-all phrase that could mean almost anything. The message was clear. The Navy had no patience for commanders who failed to engage the enemy decisively. But aggressive commanders died too. The average carrier captain's tenure in 1942 was 4.2 months before death or relief. Officers who sought carrier command understood they were accepting positions with life expectancy measured in weeks. Guadalcanal Campaign, August through November 1942. American carriers provided air support for Marines fighting desperately on that malarial island, but the operational calculus had become nightmarish. Every carrier operating near Guadalcanal risked Japanese air attack from shore-based bombers. Pull back too far, and the Marines fought without air cover. Move in too close, and carriers became targets. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force, chose to withdraw his carriers after 2 days, believing the risk of losing America's last carriers exceeded the value of supporting Guadalcanal. Marines on the island felt abandoned, watching carrier aircraft disappear over the horizon, while Japanese bombers arrived unopposed. Fletcher's decision was probably correct strategically. Losing a carrier would have been catastrophic, but it looked cowardly to the men fighting ashore. The tension between preserving scarce carriers and using them aggressively remained unsolved. USS Wasp, September 15th. The carrier was operating southeast of Guadalcanal when a Japanese submarine fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 hit. Wasp's gasoline system ruptured, igniting fires that quickly spread beyond control. Within an hour, the captain ordered abandon ship. 193 men died in the fires, and the Navy lost another irreplaceable carrier. Now, only 2 fleet carriers remained operational, Enterprise and Hornet. With them, but the Navy had to defend everything from Hawaii to Australia, support Guadalcanal, and prevent Japanese advances. The arithmetic was unsustainable. If Japan sank both remaining carriers, American naval aviation would cease to exist for months while new carriers commissioned. October 26th, Battle of Santa Cruz. Hornet and Enterprise faced 3 Japanese carriers, supporting another attempt to retake Guadalcanal. The battle was another brutal slugging match. Both sides launched full strikes simultaneously, aircraft passing each other en route to targets. Japanese bombers hit Hornet with devastating accuracy. Bombs, torpedoes, and ultimately a kamikaze crash by a damaged aircraft. The carrier was wrecked, dead in the water, burning. Mitscher had transferred off Hornet weeks earlier for reassignment. But he watched the battle reports with grim recognition. His former ship was doomed. American destroyers tried towing the wreck away, but approaching Japanese forces made that impossible. On October 27th, Hornet was scuttled, torpedoed by American destroyers to prevent Japanese capture. The United States Navy now had one operational fleet carrier left, Enterprise, one ship to hold the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, faced a desperate situation. The Essex-class carriers wouldn't arrive for months. Until then, the Navy had to fight with Enterprise alone, supported by a handful of escort carriers too small and slow for fleet operations. Nimitz needed commanders who understood carrier warfare instinctively, who could coordinate complex operations under pressure, who wouldn't break under the strain of sending men to their deaths daily. The pool of such officers was dangerously shallow. Many potential commanders had been killed or relieved. Others demonstrated excellent ship handling, but poor tactical judgment. A few were too cautious, preserving their ships but failing to engage effectively. Nimitz studied personnel files, seeking someone who combined tactical competence with strategic understanding, aggression with wisdom, courage with calculation. Marc Mitscher's file sat on Nimitz's desk for days. The record was mixed. Doolittle Raid, brilliant success. Midway, significant failures glossed over in official reports. Command style, excellent with subordinates, trusted by pilots, innovative tactically. Physical stamina, concerning. Mitscher seemed to require minimal sleep, chain-smoked constantly, showed signs of stress. Personal habits. Odd, Mitscher often stood outside during operations in all weather, watching aircraft rather than coordinating from the flag bridge. But pilots loved him. Junior officers praised his willingness to listen. And critically, Mitscher had spent more time thinking about carrier operations than almost anyone in the Navy. In December 1942, Nimitz made his decision. Mitscher would command Carrier Division 3 when the new Essex-class carriers arrived. It was a calculated gamble on a commander who had shown flashes of brilliance alongside troubling failures. Everything would depend on whether Mitscher had learned from his mistakes. By January 1943, the crisis had passed. Enterprise survived, Guadalcanal was secured, and the first Essex-class carriers were commissioning. But those terrible months from June through November had taught the Navy brutal lessons. Carrier commanders needed instant tactical judgment, no time for deliberation, no second chances for mistakes. They needed to inspire absolute confidence in their crews while accepting that some decisions would kill people. They needed to balance aggression with preservation, knowing their ships were too valuable to lose but too powerful not to use decisively. And they needed physical and mental stamina to sustain operations for months without relief. The graveyard of admirals had been necessary. The Navy had to identify commanders who could meet those impossible standards. Now, with new carriers arriving monthly, and Mitscher assuming command of a carrier division, the Pacific War would enter a new phase. And the question was whether the Navy had finally found commanders equal to the weapon they had built. Newport News, Virginia, November in 1942. 7 aircraft carriers sat on adjacent buildingways, their skeletal frames rising toward the overcast sky like steel cathedrals. Riveters swarmed over the hulls, their pneumatic hammers creating a deafening industrial symphony that continued 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These were Essex-class fleet carriers, and their simultaneous construction represented a feat of industrial organization that would have been impossible just years earlier. Each carrier required 2.5 million man-hours to complete, consumed 30,000 tons of steel, needed 47 miles of wiring, and demanded 15,000 separate components manufactured to specifications so tight that parts from one ship could fit any other. America was building these floating cities at a rate that defied belief, 1 every 3 months once production hit stride. Japan, fighting desperately across the Pacific, couldn't begin to match this output. The Essex-class design incorporated every lesson learned from earlier carriers and recent combat. The ships displaced 27,100 tons, measured 820 feet long, and could achieve 33 knots, fast enough to outrun anything they couldn't outfight. Their flight decks were armored against bombs, unlike earlier carriers where a single hit could penetrate to the hangar. They carried 100 aircraft in their hangar bays and on deck, triple the capacity of early war carriers. Their anti-aircraft batteries mounted dozens of 40mm and 20mm guns in interlocking fields of fire. Their fuel storage was compartmentalized to prevent catastrophic fires like those that destroyed Lexington and Wasp. Their damage control systems included redundant pumps, sealed compartments, and specialized firefighting equipment. Most critically, their design allowed rapid aircraft operations, 2 elevators that could move aircraft from hangar to deck in under 1 minute, catapults for assisted launches, improved arresting gear for safer landings. Philadelphia Naval Yard, March 1943. A different revolution proceeded in parallel. The Independence-class light carriers. It converted from cruiser hulls already under construction. These smaller carriers displaced 11,000 tons, carried 33 aircraft, and could be completed in 9 months rather than the 3 years required for fleet carriers. They were compromises, smaller air groups, less protection, shorter flight decks, but they were available immediately when the Navy desperately needed carrier capacity. By mid-1943, the production pipeline was yielding both types simultaneously, fleet carriers arriving quarterly, light carriers arriving monthly. The mathematics of this production made Japanese resistance increasingly futile. Japan had started the war with 10 fleet carriers and light carriers. By mid-1943, Japan had 8 operational carriers remaining. America had 12, with more launching every month. USS Essex commissioned December 31st, 1942, the first of her revolutionary class. Her shakedown cruise revealed minor problems, new equipment needing adjustment, crew learning new systems, but nothing fundamental. She was everything carrier advocates had dreamed of, powerful, fast, capable of sustained operations. By March 1943, 3 more Essex-class carriers had commissioned: Yorktown, named for the carrier lost at Midway; Intrepid; and Lexington, named for the carrier lost at Coral Sea. The symbolism was deliberate. America was not just replacing losses, but building a carrier fleet that would dominate every ocean. Each new carrier required approximately 3,000 crew and 110 pilots. Another industrial challenge in itself, training personnel as quickly as building ships. Pearl Harbor, June 1943. 3 Essex-class carriers arrived simultaneously, their gray hulls gleaming in the Hawaiian sun. Moored together, they represented more carrier tonnage than Japan's entire remaining fleet. Nimitz stood on the dock, watching sailors swarm over the ships, and allowed himself cautious optimism. For 18 months, the Navy had fought with barely adequate forces, always outnumbered, always scrambling. Now the balance was shifting irreversibly. But ships alone didn't guarantee victory. The Navy needed doctrine for employing these carriers en masse, tactics for coordinating their strikes, logistics for keeping them supplied during extended operations. Most critically, the Navy needed commanders capable of coordinating 4, 6, 8 carriers simultaneously while under enemy attack. The ships existed. The doctrine didn't. July 1943. Admiral John Towers, one of naval aviation's founding fathers, proposed a revolutionary concept: the Fast Carrier Task Force. Instead of dispersing carriers individually or in pairs, concentrate them into a massive task force that could overwhelm any defense through sheer weight of numbers. The composition Towers envisioned was staggering: 4 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 6 to 8 battleships providing anti-aircraft defense, 18 cruisers, 60 destroyers. This force would carry over 650 aircraft, more than many nations' entire air forces. It would cover roughly 1,000 square miles of ocean, operating aircraft continuously from dawn to dusk. It would be commanded as a single unit by an admiral specializing in carrier operations, not divided between multiple independent commanders. The Fast Carrier Task Force concept represented final recognition that carriers weren't auxiliary units supporting the battleship fleet. They were the fleet, and battleships now existed to protect carriers. The logistical challenges of operating such a task force were as significant as the tactical ones. 600 aircraft consumed enormous quantities of aviation fuel, roughly 300,000 gallons daily during intensive operations. Those aircraft required ordnance, bombs, torpedoes, machine gun ammunition, all delivered to carriers at sea. The ships themselves burned fuel oil at rates that would empty their bunkers within weeks. Traditional doctrine required ships to return to port for resupply every 2 weeks. But returning to port meant giving up position and tempo. That the Navy needed to supply task forces at sea continuously, transforming the fleet into a mobile base that never stopped moving. This meant developing specialized replenishment ships, fleet oilers carrying millions of gallons of fuel, ammunition ships transferring ordnance via high-speed cables between ships underway, supply ships delivering food and spare parts. It meant perfecting underway replenishment, passing fuel lines between ships moving at 15 knots in rough seas. A dangerous evolution that killed sailors when equipment failed. The aircrew training pipeline became America's secret weapon. Invisible but decisive. In 1941, the Navy trained 500 pilots. In 1943, it trained 5,000, 10 times as many. Flight schools expanded across the southern United States, churning out pilots who accumulated 1,000 hours of training before reaching combat units. They flew in all weather, practiced navigation across featureless ocean, rehearsed deck landings until the procedure became automatic. They learned dogfighting, dive bombing, torpedo runs, night flying, instrument flying. By the time they reached fleet carriers, they were more skilled than most Japanese pilots with combat experience. Japan's training program collapsed under combat losses and fuel shortages, producing pilots with 100 to 200 hours of training, barely adequate for basic flight, insufficient for combat. American numerical superiority in aircraft was multiplied by qualitative superiority in pilots. By autumn 1943, the pieces had fallen into place. Essex-class carriers were arriving monthly. Our Independence-class light carriers filled the gaps. The fast carrier task force concept had been refined through war games and preliminary operations. The logistical train existed to support extended deployments. Air crew quality had never been higher. But the Navy still faced a critical shortage. Commanders capable of coordinating this awesome striking power. Mitscher had been appointed to command Carrier Division 3, but that was just one element of a larger force. Someone needed to command the entire fast carrier task force, coordinate multiple carrier divisions, manage logistics across 90 ships, orchestrate strikes involving hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. The position required extraordinary qualities: tactical genius, strategic vision, iron nerves, physical stamina, and absolute credibility with subordinates. And in January 1944, Nimitz made his choice. Vice Admiral Marc A. Mitscher would command Task Force 58, the fast carrier Task Force Pacific. The quiet man who spoke only when necessary would now command the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Everything the Navy had built, the ships, the aircraft, the pilots, the doctrine, would succeed or fail based on whether Mitscher proved equal to this impossible responsibility. Pearl Harbor, January 1944. Vice Admiral Marc A. Mitscher stepped aboard USS Lexington, his new flagship, and surveyed the massive carrier with an expression no one could read. At 57 years old, he looked older than his years, thin to the point of gaunt, weathered face creased by years of squinting into wind and sun. Al's sparse gray hair barely visible under his signature lobster claw cap worn backwards. He stood 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed barely 140 pounds, physically unimpressive by any standard. But when pilots recognized him walking the flight deck, they stood straighter, smiled wider, felt their spirits lift. Bald Eagle had arrived, the admiral who actually cared whether they lived or died. Mitscher was assuming command of Task Force 58. 15 carriers, 90,000 sailors and Marines, 650 aircraft, battleships, and cruisers and destroyers in numbers that made the task force larger than most navies. He would control this vast armada with the fewest words possible, trusting his staff to translate his intentions into action. January 29th. First staff meeting. 30 officers crowded into the flag conference room aboard Lexington. expecting the new commander to outline his vision, explain his priorities, establish his command philosophy. Mitscher entered, refused the offered chair, and remained standing near the door. His operations officer, Captain Truman Heading, presented a detailed brief on upcoming operations. Proposed strikes against the Marshall Islands, target selection, force composition, expected opposition. Heading spoke for 20 minutes, outlining contingencies and decision points. When he finished, all eyes turned to Mitscher. The Admiral stubbed out his Camel cigarette in an ashtray, looked around the room, and spoke his first words as task force commander. "Your recommendations." Heading blinked, uncertain. "Sir?" Mitscher gestured vaguely at the planning documents. Do it." He turned toward the door. "Meeting adjourned." 7 words. His entire command guidance reduced to 7 words. Officers sat stunned as Mitscher departed, already lighting another Camel, but those 7 words contained profound command philosophy. Mitscher had selected his staff for competence and trusted them completely. Heading would plan operations. Mitscher would approve or modify them. Individual carrier captains would execute their piece of the plan using their best judgment. Fighter directors would coordinate combat air patrol based on tactical situation. Mitscher wouldn't micromanage, wouldn't second-guess, wouldn't interfere unless something went fundamentally wrong. His job was to establish intent, provide resources, and remove obstacles. Everything else belonged to subordinates who lived closer to the problem. This command style was revolutionary in a Navy accustomed to detailed orders and rigid hierarchy. It also required extraordinary confidence. Mitscher had to trust that his officers understood his intent, even when he barely expressed it. February 1st. Marshall Islands strike, Mitscher's first operation commanding the full task force. At 0630, he gave the order every pilot had waited months to hear. Launch strike. From 15 carriers simultaneously, aircraft roared into the dark pre-dawn sky. 180 fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers forming into coordinated groups while still climbing. The choreography was staggering. Aircraft from different carriers rendezvous at predetermined points. Fighters forming protective screens around bombers, entire formations proceeding to target at 200 miles per hour. Japanese radar operators on Kwajalein Atoll watched in horror as their screens filled with aircraft, more aircraft than they had ever imagined existed. The strike hit at 0800 precisely. Fighters sweeping aside the few Japanese fighters that managed to launch, bombers methodically destroying everything of military value. By 0930, Kwajalein was a smoking ruin. Not a single American aircraft was lost to Japanese defenders. This was the deck-load strike concept perfected, launching overwhelming force simultaneously rather than staggered waves that allowed the enemy to recover between attacks. Mitscher had been developing this tactic for years, understanding that timing was everything in carrier warfare. Launch too early, and aircraft wasted fuel waiting for stragglers. Launch too late, and you lost surprise. Stagger launches and early waves absorbed all the enemy's defensive fire, while late waves found targets destroyed. Launch simultaneously, and the enemy faced impossible choices. Which formation to intercept when they all arrived together? The coordination required to execute deck-load strikes was enormous. Every carrier had to launch on schedule. Every formation had to rendezvous precisely. Every aircraft had to maintain formation discipline. It was only possible with superbly trained pilots, excellent staff work, and absolute clarity of command intent. February 17th. Mitscher introduced another innovation. Big Blue Blanket. Instead of striking a target and withdrawing, Task Force 58 would establish continuous fighter patrols over Japanese bases, keeping fighters constantly overhead for days at a time. A Japanese aircraft trying to take off would be immediately attacked. Aircraft already airborne would find no friendly base to land. Ground crews trying to repair damaged aircraft would work under constant threat of strafing. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese defenders knew that American fighters were overhead every minute of every day, that no reinforcement could arrive, that survival was pure chance. Big Blue Blanket required enormous effort. Rotating fighter patrols consumed hundreds of sorties daily, but it prevented Japanese counterattacks completely. Task Force 58 could operate with near impunity because enemy airfields were suppressed continuously. The physical reality of commanding Task Force 58 was brutal. Mitscher stood on Lexington's flag bridge for 16 hours daily, watching aircraft operations, monitoring radio traffic, smoking Camels continuously. He refused his cabin most days, dozing in his bridge chair during brief lulls. His staff grew accustomed to finding him asleep standing up, cap fallen to the deck, still somehow aware of everything happening around the task force. He reviewed every pilot loss personally, examined every crashed aircraft report, studied every maintenance problem. When pilots returned from difficult missions, Mitscher often met them in the ready room, saying nothing, just his presence communicating that he understood what they had endured. He approved life jacket call signs for rescue submarines positioned along strike routes, submarines that saved downed pilots rather than attacking Japanese ships. This wasn't soft sentimentality. It was calculated leadership. Pilots who believed their commander cared about their survival flew more aggressively, took necessary risks, trusted his judgment. February 23rd. After 3 weeks of continuous operations, Task Force 58 had destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft, sunk or damaged dozens of ships, and neutralized Japanese positions across the Marshall Islands. American losses: 25 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents, not combat. The implications were clear to everyone watching. American carrier aviation had achieved absolute superiority. Japanese forces couldn't contest American control of any ocean where carriers operated. The fast carrier task force concept had proven itself dramatically, and Mitscher had demonstrated that silent leadership worked. Sometimes fewer words communicated more than lengthy orders. Then Nimitz sent personal commendation. Staff officers who had been skeptical now fully understood Mitscher's command style, and pilots throughout the task force knew they were serving under someone special. But beneath the success, warning signs emerged. Mitscher's health was deteriorating under the strain. He ate little, slept less, smoked constantly. Staff officers noticed him swaying slightly during long watches, as if he might collapse. The task force surgeon expressed concern, but Mitscher dismissed it. There would be time to rest after the war. For now, every hour mattered. Every decision could cost or save lives. Every operation brought victory closer. He drove himself ruthlessly, modeling the dedication he expected from everyone else. The question wasn't whether Mitscher would break under this pace. It was whether the Navy could afford his collapse. Because, increasingly, the outcome of the Pacific War seemed to depend on this silent, exhausted man who cared more about his pilots than his own survival. Pre-dawn darkness. February 17th, 1944. 72. Grumman Hellcat fighters launched from 5 carriers 200 miles northeast of Truk Lagoon, their engines shattering the tropical night's silence. This was the largest single fighter formation ever assembled, 72 aircraft converging on a single target, more fighters than most air forces possessed. Pilots strapped into cramped cockpits checked instruments by flashlight, tested guns, reviewed attack plans memorized during weeks of preparation. They were about to attack Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, the heavily fortified naval base that dominated the Central Pacific. For 2 years, Truk had been untouchable, too well defended for any force to risk attacking. Now, Task Force 58 was going to destroy it in a single operation. From his bridge aboard Lexington, Mitscher watched the fighters disappear into darkness and permitted himself a thin smile. The Navy was about to prove what carrier aviation had become. Truk Lagoon was the ultimate test of fast carrier task force doctrine. The base encompassed a massive coral atoll surrounding a 40-mile-wide lagoon deep enough to anchor the entire Japanese combined fleet. 4 major airfields surrounded the lagoon: Moen, Param, Dublon, Eton. Together, they hosted over 300 aircraft, fighters, bombers, reconnaissance planes. The lagoon itself sheltered 47 ships, including light cruisers, destroyers, cargo vessels, tankers, repair ships. Shore installations included ammunition depots, fuel farms, repair facilities, barracks, command centers. Concrete bunkers and anti-aircraft batteries protected key facilities. Over 40,000 Japanese military personnel manned the base. Conquering Truk through conventional amphibious assault would require months and cost thousands of lives. Mitscher intended to neutralize it in 2 days using only aircraft. 6:45 local time. The sun was just breaking the horizon when the first Hellcats roared over Truk's airfields at 50 feet altitude, their .650 caliber machine guns hammering everything that moved. And Japanese pilots scrambled toward their aircraft, but were cut down before reaching them. Zeros lined up for takeoff disintegrated under concentrated fire. Bombers caught on the ground exploded spectacularly as fuel tanks ruptured. The Japanese managed to launch about 70 fighters from 4 airfields simultaneously. A desperate, uncoordinated response to what seemed like an attack from everywhere at once. But American pilots had trained for exactly this scenario. They held altitude advantage, numerical advantage, tactical coordination. Japanese fighters climbing to altitude were bounced by Hellcats already positioned above them. Within 30 minutes, the sky belonged to Task Force 58, Truk Lagoon, noon. While fighters swept the sky clear, dive bombers and torpedo planes methodically destroyed everything in the anchorage. The light cruiser Naka took 3 torpedo hits and exploded in a fireball visible from 20 miles away, her magazines detonating, the blast tearing the ship into pieces. A tanker filled with aviation fuel erupted into an inferno that burned for hours. Cargo ships settled to the bottom, with their holds still full of supplies. Destroyers zigzagged desperately, their anti-aircraft guns blazing ineffectively as dive bombers screamed down from 12,000 feet. The Japanese had no answer to coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. Every ship that attempted to escape through the atoll's passes ran into waiting torpedo planes. By mid-afternoon, the lagoon was a graveyard of burning and sunken vessels. February 18th. Mitscher faced a critical decision. The operational plan called for withdrawal after 1 day. Fuel concerns, potential Japanese reinforcements, risk of counterattack. But reconnaissance photos showed significant targets still intact. Aircraft dispersed to auxiliary fields, ships sheltering in coves, facilities only partially destroyed. Standard doctrine said, withdraw. Mitscher's instinct said, finish the job. He studied fuel calculations, consulted weather forecasts, reviewed pilot fatigue reports. Then he made the decision that defined his command philosophy. We won't get another chance like this. Continue operations. His staff scrambled to reorganize for another day of strikes while simultaneously managing the complex logistics of refueling destroyers at sea. Mitscher stood on the flag bridge, chain-smoking, aware that extending operations increased risk, but convinced that half-destroying Truk accomplished nothing. The second day's operations demonstrated Task Force 58's maturity. Night fighters launched from carriers after dark, an experimental tactic, caught Japanese aircraft attempting to evacuate. Dawn strikes found targets the previous day had missed. Combat air patrols maintained continuous coverage over the task force, preventing Japanese bombers from locating American carriers. Coordination improved as commanders and pilots internalized the rhythm. Launch, strike, recover, rearm, launch again. By evening of February 19th, Task Force 58 had destroyed 250 Japanese aircraft, sunk 70,000 tons of shipping, and rendered Truk's facilities inoperable. American losses, 25 aircraft, all mostly to anti-aircraft fire or operational accidents. The exchange rate was 10-1 in America's favor, but the operation's significance transcended statistics. Truk had been Japan's Central Pacific stronghold, the anchor of their defensive perimeter, the base from which they could threaten Allied advances. Everyone had assumed conquering Truk would require a massive amphibious assault similar to Tarawa or Saipan. Months of preparation, thousands of casualties, uncertain outcome. Mitscher proved that carrier aviation had evolved beyond merely supporting amphibious operations. Carriers could now eliminate heavily defended bases through air power alone, rendering those bases useless without ever landing troops. The implications were revolutionary. Japan had built defensive lines across the Pacific based on fortified bases that carriers could now simply bypass, isolating and neutralizing them without bloody assaults. Japanese strategic planners watched Truk's destruction with mounting horror. The combined fleet had already evacuated to Palau weeks earlier, anticipating American attack, but losing Truk as an operational base fundamentally changed Pacific War geometry. Supply routes collapsed. Aircraft staged through Truk could no longer reinforce southern positions. The defensive perimeter Japanese leaders had bled to establish was suddenly porous, penetrable anywhere American carriers appeared. And there was no way to predict where carriers would strike next. They could appear anywhere, destroy anything, and disappear before Japanese forces could respond. Admiral Koga, commanding the combined fleet, recognized that Japan's defensive strategy was obsolete. The Navy would have to confront American carriers directly, seeking the decisive battle that would destroy this threat. That confrontation was coming soon. The night after Truk's destruction, Mitscher allowed himself rare satisfaction. Task Force 58 had executed complex coordinated operations involving 15 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of personnel with minimal losses and maximum effectiveness. The pilots had performed brilliantly, the staff had coordinated flawlessly, the logistics had held despite extending operations. Every innovation he had developed over decades, deck load strikes, big blue blanket, continuous operations, in life jacket submarines, had worked exactly as designed. But Mitscher's mood was tempered by awareness of what came next. Truk had been formidable, but stationary, predictable. Somewhere out there, Japanese carrier forces were preparing their counterstrike. The ultimate test of fast carrier task force doctrine would come when American and Japanese carrier forces collided in open ocean, mobile against mobile, with neither side enjoying positional advantage. Mitscher knew that battle was inevitable. He just didn't know when or where. But when it came, everything would depend on whether Task Force 58 could coordinate its overwhelming numerical advantage faster and more effectively than Japanese desperation and fanaticism. The revolution would face its greatest test soon. Flag Bridge, USS Lexington. March 19, 44, net 0300. The night watch found Admiral Mitscher standing at his usual position on the open bridge, staring into darkness while Task Force 58 plowed through rough seas toward Palau. He had been on watch for 16 hours. Staff officers had suggested he rest, but Mitscher had dismissed them with a characteristic headshake. He couldn't sleep while his pilots were scheduled to strike at dawn, couldn't rest knowing that planning errors cost lives. So, he stood there, chain-smoking camels, one after another, the glowing tip providing the only light in the blackness. His cap, the lobster claw worn backwards, seemed part of his skull, never removed. His thin frame swayed slightly with the ship's motion, but he remained upright, almost motionless except for raising cigarettes to his lips. The youngest signalman on watch wondered how long the old man could keep standing. The chief petty officer, who had served under Mitscher longer, knew better than to wonder. The admiral would stand until the operation was complete, however long that took. This was Marc Mitscher's definition of command. Presence. Not speeches, not elaborate orders, just being there when it mattered. Pilots launching before dawn would see him watching from the bridge, silhouetted against the sky. Pilots returning after dark would find him still there, counting aircraft as they recovered. If an aircraft crashed, Mitscher witnessed it. If a pilot went missing, Mitscher knew immediately. His staff handled tactics and logistics and communications, but Mitscher provided something else, a physical guarantee that someone cared about every person under his command. It was leadership through witness, through shared suffering, through silent solidarity, and it was destroying him. March 30th. Ready room aboard Enterprise. Mitscher did something unprecedented for a task force commander. He personally briefed pilots on their mission. Squadron commanders typically handled briefings, with task force admirals remaining distant figures issuing general orders. But Mitscher entered the ready room, studied the assembled pilots, most of them younger than 30, some barely 20, and spoke in his quiet, almost inaudible voice. Weather is deteriorating. Expect heavy clouds over target. Escape route Delta offers best chance if you get separated. Life jacket submarines are positioned here, here, and here. He indicated points on the map. "Rescue aircraft standing by. If you go down, we will find you." Questions? No inspirational speech, no pep talk, just practical information that might save lives. Pilots filed out more confident than they had entered. The old man knew what mattered, but Mitscher's obsession with pilot survival led to decisions that horrified cautious staff officers. On the night of April 1st, 23 aircraft from various carriers got separated during recovery operations, scattered across hundreds of miles of dark ocean, fuel gauges reading empty. Standard procedure dictated maintaining radio silence and blacked-out conditions. Submarine threats were real, and illuminating ships could invite attack. Mitscher listened to desperate radio calls from lost pilots, studied the tactical situation, and made his decision. "Turn on the lights." Staff officers protested. "Submarines, sir, will be visible for miles." Yet Mitscher cut them off. "Turn on every light on every ship, now." Across 90 ships, searchlights snapped on, flight deck lights illuminated, even truck lights on battleships were activated. Task Force 58 lit up like a carnival, visible from 50 miles away. A beacon guiding lost aircraft home. Submarines could attack, but Mitscher had decided that 23 pilots' lives were worth the risk. All 23 aircraft landed safely. No submarine attacked. Mitscher's gamble succeeded, establishing a precedent that would save hundreds of pilots over the coming months. April 19, 44. The task force surgeon requested a meeting with Mitscher, bringing several pages of medical notes. "Admiral, you're not sleeping more than 3 to 4 hours per night. You've lost significant weight. Your hands shake. Your concentration lapses during afternoon watches. You need rest." Mitscher stubbed out his Camel and immediately lit another. "Can't spare the time?" The surgeon persisted. "Sir, at your age, this pace is unsustainable. You're at risk of collapse, possibly worse." Mitscher looked at him with eyes that seemed infinitely tired. "How many pilots we lose last week?" The surgeon checked his notes. 17, sir." "And if I rested, would that be less?" The surgeon had no answer. Mitscher stood. "When the war is over, I'll sleep." The meeting was over, but the cost of this dedication showed in everything about Mitscher. His uniform hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His face, always thin, now seemed skeletal. His fingers were stained yellow from constant smoking, 4 packs daily by some estimates. Staff officers developed informal watches, and ensuring someone monitored the Admiral because he occasionally swayed as if about to collapse. The task force photographer captured images that shocked Nimitz in Pearl Harbor. Mitscher asleep, standing up on the bridge, cap fallen to the deck, body upright only because he had locked his knees. Nimitz sent concerned messages. Mitscher ignored them. There were operations to plan, pilots to protect, battles to win. Yet this near-suicidal work ethic achieved something crucial: absolute pilot loyalty. Every pilot in Task Force 58 knew their admiral cared whether they lived or died, knew he would light up the entire task force to bring them home, knew he personally reviewed every loss and worked to prevent the next one. They flew more aggressively knowing rescue forces would search for them. They took necessary risks knowing life jacket submarines waited along strike routes. They trusted Mitscher's judgment because his judgment prioritized their survival, even at cost to his own health. This trust translated into tactical effectiveness. Pilots pushed their aircraft to limits because they believed their commander would recover them if something went wrong. The submarine and seaplane rescue network Mitscher established became Task Force 58's signature program. Submarines positioned along strike routes surfaced to recover downed pilots, then submerged before Japanese forces could counterattack. Seaplanes flew out from captured atolls to search areas beyond carrier-based aircraft range. Destroyers detached from the task force to investigate any report of a downed pilot. The statistics were remarkable. 86% of pilots who went down in water were rescued, compared to perhaps 20% earlier in the war. Every rescued pilot flew again, his experience preserved for future operations. But more significantly, the knowledge that rescue was almost certain transformed pilot psychology. Fear of being killed was one thing. Fear of dying slowly in a life raft hundreds of miles from help was another. Mitscher eliminated the second fear. May 1944, After 4 months of continuous combat command, Mitscher had aged a decade. His staff worried constantly about his health, but could do nothing. He refused relief, refused rest, refused any suggestion that he couldn't sustain this pace. He stood on his bridge watching aircraft operations, smoked his endless cigarettes, dozed in his chair during brief lulls, and drove himself toward an edge everyone could see approaching. But he had transformed Task Force 58 from a collection of ships into a weapon of extraordinary precision and power. His pilots would follow him anywhere. His staff anticipated his intent with minimal communication. His tactics had been validated by every operation. Now, the ultimate test approached. Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japanese carriers would attempt one final decisive blow. Mitscher would command the American response, and everything, his health, his judgment, his years of experience, would be tested against Japan's desperate gamble. The quiet man who wouldn't sleep was about to face the greatest carrier battle in history. June 19th, 1944. 1,000 hours. The radar operator aboard USS Lexington stared at his scope, watching a formation appear that seemed impossible. Bogies bearing 265, distance 150 miles, many aircraft. His voice remained professionally calm, but his hands shook as he adjusted the scope. The formation was enormous, not a single raid, but multiple waves, each containing dozens of aircraft. Within minutes, the count climbed. 50 aircraft, 70, 90. The fighter director officer grabbed the radio microphone. Vector 265, Angels 25, many bogies, looks like the whole Japanese Navy. From his position on the flag bridge, Mitscher heard the report and felt something close to relief. For months, Japanese carriers had avoided combat, husbanding their forces, waiting for the perfect moment. Now they had committed everything to one desperate attack. The battle Marc Mitscher had been preparing for his entire career was finally beginning. The Japanese plan was audacious and deeply flawed. Vice Admiral Jizaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers, 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, with 473 aircraft. His objective? Destroy American carrier forces supporting the invasion of Saipan, eliminating the threat to Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Ozawa believed he held several advantages. Japanese aircraft had longer range than American types, allowing strikes from beyond American response range. Japanese carriers could base aircraft at Guam, creating a shuttle bombing system where aircraft struck American carriers, landed at Guam to rearm, struck again while returning to their carriers. And Ozawa believed American pilots were inferior to Japan's veteran aviators. Every one of these assumptions was catastrophically wrong. Task Force 58 now comprised 15 carriers with 900 aircraft, twice Ozawa's strength. More critically, American pilots averaged over 1,000 hours of flight time versus 100 to 200 hours for recently trained Japanese pilots. Japan's veteran aviators, survivors of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, had been killed over 2 years of attrition warfare. Replacements had minimal training due to Japan's collapsed training infrastructure and critical fuel shortages. The Japanese formation heading toward Task Force 58 contained barely 50 pilots with significant combat experience. They were flying to their deaths, and many of them probably knew it. 1,100 hours. Mitscher made his critical decision: fight defensively. Standard doctrine called for immediately launching counterstrike against Japanese carriers while defending against their attack. But Mitscher calculated that his fighters could destroy the Japanese strike before it reached Task Force 58, preserving American carriers for a counterstrike later. Launch all fighters, strengthen combat air patrol to maximum. Within minutes, 250 Hellcats were airborne, stacked at various altitudes from 10,000 to 30,000 feet, creating a defensive shield 50 miles deep. Japanese aircraft would have to penetrate layer after layer of fighters, each layer having altitude or position advantage, before reaching American carriers. 11:30. Contact. The first Hellcats intercepted Japanese formations 70 miles from Task Force 58. What followed was slaughter so one-sided it earned an immediate nickname: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, inadequately trained and flying outdated aircraft, stood no chance against American pilots in superior aircraft with tactical advantage. Hellcat pilots bounced Japanese formations from above and behind, the classic advantageous position. Japanese formations disintegrated under attack, bombers jettisoning their weapons and attempting escape, fighters desperately trying to protect bombers while Hellcats systematically destroyed both. Of 69 aircraft in the first Japanese wave, 42 were destroyed before getting within sight of American ships. The remaining 27 scattered, attempting individual attacks, and were hunted down by reserve fighters. Not a single aircraft from the first wave survived to return to Japanese carriers. 1,300. Second Japanese wave, 109 aircraft. Same result. Hellcats intercepted 40 miles out, destroyed 70 aircraft, scattered the remainder. 6 Japanese aircraft penetrated to attack battleship Alabama. All 6 shot down by anti-aircraft fire without landing hits. 1,400. Third wave, 47 aircraft. Destroyed piecemeal as they straggled toward the task force. 1,500. Fourth wave, 82 aircraft. Intercepted 60 miles out, only 30 reached American ships. Achieved 2 minor bomb hits on battleships, no significant damage. By 1,600 hours, the battle was over. The Japanese had launched 373 aircraft in 4 waves. Like American fighters and anti-aircraft fire, destroyed 243, 65% of the attacking force, without seriously damaging a single American ship. But while Task Force 58 defended itself, Mitscher's submarines and search aircraft located the Japanese fleet. USS Albacore torpedoed carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, at 0900. The carrier didn't sink immediately, but poor damage control allowed gasoline vapors to spread throughout the ship. At 1530, Taiho exploded catastrophically, sinking rapidly. USS Kavala torpedoed carrier Shokaku, one of Pearl Harbor's attackers, at 1200. Shokaku also succumbed to uncontrolled fires, sinking at 1500. The Japanese had lost 2 fleet carriers and 243 aircraft without sinking anything. It was the most lopsided carrier battle in history, but it wasn't over. 1,600 hours. Mitscher received confirmation. Japanese fleet located, bearing 270, distance 275 miles, retiring westward. He faced the war's most agonizing decision. American aircraft had barely enough range to strike at that distance. They would arrive over target at sunset, fight their engagement, and return to Task Force 58 after dark. Night carrier operations were extremely dangerous. Many pilots had never attempted night landings. Launching guaranteed heavy losses, perhaps 50 or more aircraft. But not launching meant allowing the Japanese fleet to escape, possibly to fight again, when American ground forces on Saipan would be vulnerable. Mitscher stood silently on the flag bridge for long minutes, smoking, decalculating, weighing lives against strategic necessity. "Launch them," Mitscher said quietly. His staff scrambled to organize the strike. 216 aircraft from 11 carriers. Pilots manned aircraft knowing they faced a one-way mission in terms of fuel. They could reach the target, conduct a brief engagement, and might make it back before fuel exhaustion. Many understood they would ditch in the ocean after dark, hoping for rescue, but no one hesitated. If Bald Eagle ordered the strike, it was necessary. At 1636, the last aircraft launched. Mitscher watched them disappear toward the setting sun and turned to his chief of staff. "Get the lights ready. We're going to need them." 1840. The strike found the Japanese fleet and attacked in fading twilight. American bombers sank carrier Hio. It damaged several other ships, destroyed 65 additional Japanese aircraft in combat. But sunset came before recovery was complete. Pilots began returning to Task Force 58 after dark with fuel gauges reading empty, searching desperately for their carriers in total darkness. Aircraft began ditching in the ocean, crews inflating life rafts, hoping rescue would find them. The situation was catastrophic. 1900. Mitscher made his second historic decision of the day. Turn on the lights. Everything. Every ship in Task Force 58 illuminated simultaneously. searchlights stabbed the sky. Flight deck lights blazed, signal lights flashed, star shells arched overhead. The entire task force, 98 ships, lit up like a city, visible for 100 miles, and marking itself for any submarine or surface raider within range. Mitscher accepted total vulnerability to save his pilots. Aircraft homed on the lights, landing on whichever carrier they found first. Procedure abandoned in favor of survival. Some landed gear up, bellying onto decks. Some crashed into barriers. Some missed entirely and ditched alongside. But most landed successfully, guided home by Mitscher's beacon. By 2200, recovery was complete. 80 aircraft had been lost. Some shot down over the Japanese fleet, most ditched from fuel exhaustion. But destroyers and seaplanes spent the night searching, guided by signal flares and radio beacons. Over the next 2 days, 160 aircrew were rescued, 76% of those who went into the water. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was over. The Japanese had lost 3 carriers, 445 aircraft, and 445 irreplaceable aircrew. American losses: 123 aircraft, mostly to fuel exhaustion, 76 aircrew, 0 ships. Japanese carrier aviation ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Never again would Japan threaten American carrier forces with coordinated strikes. But controversy followed immediately. Critics argued Mitscher should have launched counterstrike earlier, aggressively pursuing the Japanese fleet for complete destruction rather than fighting defensively. They claimed he had won a defensive victory, when offensive action could have annihilated the Japanese fleet entirely. Mitscher listened to criticism silently, smoking, and then offered his only defense. "I brought my boys home." He had prioritized pilot survival over maximizing enemy losses, chosen certain defensive victory over risky offensive gamble, accepted criticism rather than accept preventable casualties. It was the decision that defined his command philosophy. Pilots first, always, even when it cost him glory. The strategic impact became clear over following months. Japanese carriers still existed but had no trained pilots to fly from them. Japan had started the war with 3,500 naval aviators. By June 1944, perhaps 500 remained, most too inexperienced for combat. The training pipeline was broken. No fuel for training, no experienced instructors, no time to rebuild. Japanese carriers would appear in future operations, but only as decoys, as bait to draw American forces while surface ships attempted decisive action. The carrier as an offensive weapon was finished for Japan. Everything that followed, the kamikaze campaign, the desperate surface actions, the acceptance of annihilation, traced back to June 19th, when Mitscher's fighter pilots destroyed Japanese naval aviation in 8 hours. The quiet man who brought his boys home had achieved what 2 years of brutal warfare had been designed to accomplish, breaking Japan's ability to contest control of the Pacific. Now came the grinding, terrible work of finishing the war. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. October 20th, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur waded through waist-deep water toward the beach, cameras recording his return to the Philippines as promised 2 years earlier. Above him, and so many American aircraft circled that their engines created a constant roar, reassuring and overwhelming simultaneously. Task Force 38, Marc Mitscher's command, redesignated under Admiral William Halsey's overall authority, provided air cover so dense that Japanese aircraft couldn't approach. MacArthur's theatrical beach landing was possible only because carrier aviation dominated the sky absolutely. But this operation was different from everything preceding it. The Philippines campaign would require sustained carrier operations for months, not days, supporting ground forces fighting inland beyond range of any land-based air support. Carriers had proven they could destroy enemy fleets and neutralize enemy bases, and now they would prove they could provide continuous support for extended ground campaigns, a mission requiring new levels of endurance and coordination. The strategic situation heading into Leyte was deceptively simple. MacArthur's forces would invade Leyte, establish air bases, then advance on Luzon and Manila. Task Force 38 would provide air cover until land-based aircraft could operate from captured fields. Japanese forces would resist using whatever remained of their Navy and Air Force. But the Japanese had developed a plan so desperate, so complex, that its very audacity nearly succeeded. Operation Shogo, Victory Operation, committed virtually every remaining Japanese warship to a coordinated attack on the Leyte invasion force. Three separate forces would converge simultaneously: battleships and cruisers through San Bernardino Strait from the north, more battleships through Surigao Strait from the south, and Japanese carriers, now nearly empty of aircraft, approaching from the northeast as bait to draw American carriers away from the landing beaches. October 23rd. American submarines contacted the Japanese center force advancing through Philippine waters. 5 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 10 cruisers, 15 destroyers. The submarines sank 2 cruisers and reported the force's composition and heading. Mitscher, now subordinate to Admiral Halsey, who commanded overall operations, prepared Task Force 38 for engagement. This was exactly the confrontation carrier aviation had been designed for: enemy battleships in open water, vulnerable to air attack, attempting to reach American amphibious forces. But the command structure created confusion. Halsey commanded strategically, Mitscher tactically, and the division of authority would prove disastrous. October the 24th. Task Force 38 aircraft found the center force in the Philippine Sea and attacked in waves. The super battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato, displacing 72,000 tons, mounting 9 18-inch guns, became the primary target. American pilots recognized her instantly. The largest battleship in the world, symbol of Japanese naval power, exactly what carrier aviation existed to destroy. For 8 hours, wave after wave of bombers attacked. Musashi absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits, more punishment than any ship in history had survived. Her anti-aircraft crews fought desperately. Her damage control teams sealed hundreds of compartments. Her captain maneuvered evasively, despite multiple rudder failures. But physics was inevitable. At 19:30, Musashi capsized and sank, taking half her crew with her. The mighty battleship had been destroyed by aircraft, vindicating every carrier advocate's prediction. But Halsey misread the situation catastrophically. Japanese carriers appeared northeast of Leyte, exactly as Japanese planners intended. Halsey saw what he wanted to see: enemy carriers, the ultimate prize, the targets every carrier commander dreamed of destroying. He ordered Task Force 38 to pursue northward, and chasing the nearly empty Japanese carriers and taking all the American battleships with him. Mitscher, subordinate to Halsey, followed orders despite misgivings. The center force, battered but still dangerous, was left unwatched. During the night, the Japanese reversed course and advanced through San Bernardino Strait, emerging off Samar at dawn exactly as planned. Between them and the vulnerable invasion transports stood only a small force of escort carriers and destroyers. The 7th Fleet's escort carriers designed for ground support, not fleet combat. October 25th, 0645. The battle off Samar. Escort carriers, small, slow, barely armed, found themselves facing Japanese battleships at close range. The ensuing engagement was David versus Goliath. Destroyers making suicidal torpedo runs to protect carriers. Escort carriers launching their few aircraft armed with anti-submarine depth charges because that's all they carried, and Japanese battleships closing for the kill. The escort carriers ran for their lives, their 18-knot maximum speed barely half what pursuing battleships could achieve. Destroyers USS Johnston Owell and Samuel B. Roberts attacked repeatedly, firing every torpedo, engaging battleships with their tiny 5-inch guns, accepting annihilation to buy the carriers minutes of escape time. It was some of the most desperate combat of the entire war. Small ships fighting opponents they had no chance of defeating. Mitscher, 300 miles north, chasing empty Japanese carriers, received desperate calls for help. Escort carrier Gambier Bay was sinking under battleship fire. The invasion transports, thousands of soldiers, in tons of supplies, were in mortal danger. Halsey's decision to chase the decoy carriers had left the invasion force exposed. Mitscher immediately detached aircraft to support Samar, but they arrived too late to prevent Gambier Bay's loss. destroyers Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts were all sunk. Over 1,500 sailors died in actions that should never have happened. The Japanese center force inexplicably withdrew after achieving surface contact. They were literally firing on escort carriers when they turned back, perhaps assuming heavier American forces were approaching. The invasion force survived, but the battle revealed dangerous confusion in American command structure. November through December, the Philippines campaign became a grinding attrition battle. The Task Force 38 provided continuous air support, strikes against Japanese airfields, combat air patrol over invasion beaches, interdiction of Japanese supply lines, close air support for advancing ground troops. The operational tempo was punishing. Carriers remained at sea for 75 consecutive days, refueling and rearming from supply ships, conducting operations continuously. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily. Maintenance crews worked 16-hour shifts, keeping aircraft operational. The sustained operations that Mitscher had pioneered now became routine, but routine didn't make them less exhausting. December 18th, 1944. Nature inflicted what Japanese forces couldn't. A typhoon approached Task Force 38, and Admiral Halsey, focused on operations, ignored weather warnings from his meteorologists. Mitscher, subordinate to Halsey, advised caution, but was overruled. The task force attempted to refuel during deteriorating conditions, an already dangerous evolution made catastrophic by rising seas. As the typhoon struck, destroyers, smaller ships with less stability, began rolling violently. 3 destroyers capsized and sank: USS Hull, Monaghan, and Spence. 790 sailors drowned. 146 aircraft were destroyed when they broke loose from hangar decks and smashed into each other. 9 ships were damaged seriously enough to require extensive repairs. The loss equaled the worst battle damage the task force had ever suffered, and it was entirely preventable. The typhoon disaster illustrated the hidden cost of sustained operations. Exhaustion bred mistakes, and mistakes killed people. Halsey had been at sea as long as anyone, making decisions continuously under stress, and his judgment failed when it mattered most. A board of inquiry investigated, came within 1 vote of recommending Halsey's relief, but ultimately blamed the disaster on inadequate meteorological forecasting. The truth was simpler. Everyone was exhausted, operating at the edge of human endurance, and sustained operations demanded sustained alertness that no one could maintain indefinitely. Mitscher had warned about this. His own collapse was visible evidence, but the warning went unheeded until nature enforced the lesson brutally. By January 1945, the Philippines campaign had achieved its objectives, but at cost. Now ground forces controlled Leyte and were advancing on Luzon. Japanese forces had been defeated operationally, though fighting continued. But Task Force 38 had been operating continuously for 4 months, longer than any carrier force in history. Ships needed maintenance, crews needed rest, equipment needed replacement. Most critically, commanders needed relief. Mitscher had been in combat command for 13 months without break, commanding the most complex military operations ever attempted. His health was deteriorating visibly. Staff officers reported the admiral sleeping, standing up regularly now, sometimes swaying dangerously as if about to collapse. His weight had dropped below 130 pounds. His hands shook constantly. He smoked 6 packs of Camels daily. It's the cigarettes keeping him alert when his body demanded sleep. Something had to give, and everyone knew it. The question was only whether Mitscher would collapse before the Navy relieved him, and what that collapse would cost the operations depending on his judgment. The Philippines had been taken, but the quiet man was breaking under the strain of his own dedication. October 25th, 1944, 1400 hours. A single Mitsubishi Zero fighter emerged from clouds above the escort carrier formation off Samar, not attacking conventionally, but diving directly toward USS St. Louis flight deck. Anti-aircraft guns tracked the aircraft, firing desperately. But the Zero never wavered. It plunged into St. Louis deck, penetrated to the hangar bay, and exploded. The carrier's bomb magazine detonated in a massive secondary explosion. Within 30 minutes, St. Louis was sinking. 114 sailors died. The Imperial Japanese Navy had just introduced a new weapon, organized suicide attacks by aircraft deliberately crashed into ships. The Japanese called it kamikaze, divine wind, after the typhoon that had destroyed a Mongol invasion fleet centuries earlier. American sailors called it by unprintable names, and everyone understood immediately that carrier warfare had just changed fundamentally and terrifyingly. The kamikaze campaign emerged from Japanese desperation and cultural context. By late 1944, Japan had lost most experienced pilots, couldn't train replacements adequately due to fuel shortages, and faced American forces so numerically superior that conventional tactics were hopeless. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding Japanese naval aviation in the Philippines, proposed organizing special attack units whose pilots would deliberately crash explosive-laden aircraft into ships. The proposal appealed to Japanese military culture's emphasis on sacrifice, while also solving tactical problems. Pilot skill became irrelevant if the mission was simply flying into the target, and a 2,000-pound bomb delivered with perfect accuracy, the aircraft itself, could destroy any ship. Within days, volunteers filled the special attack units far beyond available aircraft. Young pilots, many barely trained, embraced missions promising certain death if they achieved national glory. The tactical effectiveness was immediately apparent and deeply troubling. A conventional air attack required pilots to approach targets, avoid anti-aircraft fire, release weapons accurately, and escape. Multiple opportunities for defensive fire to disrupt the attack. Kamikaze attacks eliminated the escape phase. Pilots simply flew through defensive fire directly into targets. Even badly wounded aircraft could complete their mission if the pilot remained conscious long enough to crash. And the psychological impact on defenders was corrosive. American sailors could shoot down attacking aircraft, but if fragments of that aircraft still carried momentum toward the ship, even success meant disaster. The equation had changed from shoot them down to completely destroy them at sufficient range that fragments can't reach us. This required destroying attackers a mile away, difficult with 1944 radar and fire control. November 25, 1944. USS Intrepid, one of Mitscher's Task Force 38 carriers, operating off the Philippines. Two kamikazes penetrated the carrier's combat air patrol and anti-aircraft screen. Both crashed into the carrier within seconds of each other, penetrating the flight deck, igniting fires in the hangar bay. 69 sailors died in the explosions and fires. Damage control teams fought the fires for hours before containing them. Intrepid survived but required months of repairs. The attack demonstrated what everyone feared. Even the new Essex-class carriers with their armored decks could be mission-killed by determined suicide attacks. And Japan had hundreds of aircraft and thousands of pilots willing to die. The physics of defending against kamikazes revealed the problem's intractability. A Zero fighter at full speed, 350 miles per hour, covered 1 mile in 10 seconds. Radar of 1944 could detect incoming aircraft perhaps 20 to 30 miles away under ideal conditions. Less in poor weather, or if attackers flew low, that provided 3 to 5 minutes warning at best. During those minutes, carriers had to launch additional fighters, vector existing combat air patrol to intercept, prepare anti-aircraft batteries, and maneuver to present minimal target profile. All even executing everything perfectly. Some attackers penetrated to attack range, and it required only one success to inflict catastrophic damage. January 21st, 1945. USS Ticonderoga, another Essex-class carrier, hit by 2 kamikazes while operating off Formosa. One struck the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar. The second hit the ship's island, destroying the bridge and killing most senior officers present. 143 sailors died, the highest single-day carrier casualties of the war. Ticonderoga survived, but was out of action for months. The cumulative effect of these attacks began affecting operational planning. Every carrier hit required replacement. Every carrier damaged meant aircraft couldn't launch for days or weeks. The Navy was winning the war, but bleeding carriers faster than even American industry could replace them. Mitscher studied kamikaze tactics obsessively, searching for defensive solutions. The fundamental problem was mathematical. not enough time between detection and impact to guarantee interception. He proposed expanding combat air patrol radius to 70 miles from the task force, intercepting attackers before they could begin their final approach. This required more fighters constantly airborne, which reduced the bombers available for strikes, which reduced offensive capability. But keeping carriers undamaged mattered more than maximizing strike tonnage. Mitscher also advocated for radar picket destroyers positioned 50 to 75 miles from carriers specifically to provide early warning of approaching aircraft. These picket ships would draw attacks themselves, becoming deliberate targets to protect carriers. The radar picket destroyer concept revealed the terrible calculus of kamikaze warfare. Destroyers positioned between carriers and Japanese air bases would detect incoming raids first, vector fighters to intercept, and provide critical minutes of warning. But destroyers were also targets, and kamikazes that couldn't reach carriers would attack the pickets instead. The Navy was deliberately positioning destroyers where they would absorb attacks meant for carriers, trading destroyer crews' lives for carrier crews' lives. It was cold strategic logic. Better to lose a destroyer with 300 crew than a carrier with 3,000. But it was the kind of logic that haunted commanders making it. February 1945. Then Task Force 58, Mitscher resumed command after Halsey rotated back to administrative duties, prepared for operations supporting Iwo Jima and striking Japan itself. Intelligence indicated Japan was organizing massive kamikaze operations called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, attacks involving hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. The implications were clear. The kamikazes weren't isolated desperate attacks by individuals. They were systematically organized operations with dedicated training, command structure, and tactical doctrine. Japan was institutionalizing suicide warfare. Mitscher's countermeasures evolved continuously. Combat air patrol expanded to 200 fighters continuously airborne in layered zones. Close-in defense within 25 miles, intermediate zone at 50 miles, long-range interception beyond 70 miles. Fighter directors aboard carriers coordinated intercepts using improved radar and radio communications, vectoring fighters to optimal intercept positions. Anti-aircraft batteries were reinforced with proximity-fused shells that exploded near targets rather than requiring direct hits. Battleships and cruisers positioned around carriers provided additional anti-aircraft fire. The task force operated as an integrated air defense system, every component coordinated against the kamikaze threat. But statistics remained troubling. Kamikaze success rates ran 14 to 15%, meaning 1 in 7 attackers penetrated defenses and hit targets. Conventional bombing achieved 1 to 2% success rates. The kamikazes were 7 times more effective than conventional attacks, despite being flown by minimally trained pilots in obsolete aircraft. If Japan committed thousands of kamikazes to defending Okinawa and the home islands, American carriers might suffer unsustainable losses regardless of defensive measures. Mitscher understood this arithmetic grimly. The Navy was heading into operations where kamikaze attacks would be constant, organized, and massive. His carriers would have to survive months of this bombardment while supporting invasions. The question wasn't whether carriers would be hit. That was inevitable. But whether enough carriers would survive to maintain operations. The war's climactic battles were approaching. And the Divine Wind threatened to blow American carrier forces out of Japanese waters, despite all Mitscher's tactical genius and his pilots' courage. The revolution in carrier warfare faced its greatest test. Could carriers remain viable when the enemy had embraced death as doctrine? February 16th, 1945. Dawn, 120 miles southeast of Tokyo. Task Force 58 launched the largest single strike in naval aviation history. 1,200 aircraft from 16 carriers, all heading toward the Japanese capital. This was the Doolittle Raid multiplied by 75. Not 16 bombers, but over 1,000 aircraft. Not a symbolic pinprick, but systematic destruction of Japan's war industry. For 3 years, the Pacific War had been fought across thousands of miles of ocean on remote islands. Then anywhere, except Japan itself. Now, Marc Mitscher was bringing carrier aviation to the enemy's home waters, fulfilling the promise that had begun in April 1942 when Hornet launched Doolittle's bombers. But this time, American carriers weren't raiders striking and fleeing. They were a fleet so powerful they could operate within range of Japan's homeland defenses and dare the enemy to stop them. The strategic logic was brutal. Tujima, barely 800 miles from Tokyo, was being invaded by Marines who needed carrier air support. But carriers supporting Iwo also had range to strike Japan itself. Mitscher proposed doing both simultaneously. Support the invasion while simultaneously attacking Japanese aircraft factories, preventing reinforcements from reaching Iwo. Or the audacity was staggering, dividing Task Force 58 to conduct major operations 300 miles apart, both deep in range of Japanese land-based aviation. Critics argued it was reckless. Mitscher argued it was necessary. Nimitz approved, trusting the quiet admiral's judgment. The morning strike found Tokyo obscured by weather, heavy clouds and snow, reducing visibility to near zero. Pilots navigated by radar and dead reckoning, emerging from clouds directly over targets with barely seconds to acquire aim points. Japanese fighters rose to intercept, perhaps 150 Zeros and other types, the most intense fighter opposition than Task Force 58 had faced in months. The sky over Tokyo became a swirling dogfight. American Hellcats tangling with Japanese defenders while bombers pressed attacks below. Anti-aircraft fire was heavy, accurate, desperate. Japanese gunners knew they were defending the capital itself, that American bombers were violating sacred airspace, and they fired with frantic intensity. Aircraft factories around Tokyo burned by noon. The Nakajima plant at Ota, producing engines, destroyed. The Musashino plant-building bomber fuselages, heavily damaged. Smaller factories assembling components, hit repeatedly. But the cost was significant. 60 American aircraft shot down, most to anti-aircraft fire, some to fighters. 60 aircraft represented more losses than Truk, more than the Philippine Sea, more than most recent operations combined. The weather that obscured targets also prevented accurate bombing and complicated navigation. Some squadrons got lost, running low on fuel while searching for carriers, several ditching in rough seas when fuel ran out. The operation achieved its objectives, but bloodily, expensively. February 17th. Mitscher ordered night strikes, an experimental tactic using radar-equipped bombers to attack in darkness. Japanese defenders, exhausted from daylight combat, were unprepared for nocturnal assault. The night strikes succeeded brilliantly, hitting targets with minimal losses, but revealed the operational strain. Task Force 58 was enduring. Pilots were flying multiple sorties daily, day and night, with minimal rest between missions. Maintenance crews serviced aircraft around the clock. The logistical system strained to deliver ordnance, fuel, replacement parts to carriers that were consuming supplies at unprecedented rates. Everyone was exhausted, but the pace couldn't slow. Marines on Iwo Jima needed support, and Japanese aircraft factories needed destruction. February 19th. D-Day at Iwo Jima. Marines stormed ashore on the volcanic island's black sand beaches, while Task Force 58 aircraft provided close air support. Simultaneously, other carriers continued striking Japan 300 miles north. The divided operation worked exactly as Mitscher had predicted. Enough carriers near Iwo to support the invasion, enough carriers striking Japan to prevent reinforcement. But the task force was stretched thin, operating at maximum tempo with no reserves. Any major Japanese counterattack could prove disastrous. Mitscher stood on Lexington's bridge, watching aircraft launch and recover continuously, calculating fuel margins and pilot fatigue and risk probabilities. Chain smoking, as always. March 18th. Task Force 58 returned to Japanese waters for another round of strikes, now targeting Kobe and Kure Naval Arsenal. Japanese defenders were waiting, and kamikaze attacks began immediately. USS Wasp, the third carrier to bear that name, was hit by a kamikaze that penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar. 101 sailors died. The carrier survived but was forced to withdraw for repairs. USS Franklin absorbed 2 bomb hits from a Japanese bomber that penetrated the combat air patrol at dawn. The bombs detonated among armed and fueled aircraft on Franklin's hangar deck, triggering catastrophic secondary explosions. What happened aboard Franklin over the next hours became legendary, and 724 sailors and Marines died in the initial explosions and subsequent fires. The carrier lost all power, couldn't steer, dead in the water 30 miles from Japanese airfields while fires raged throughout the ship. Most of the crew abandoned ship, believing Franklin was doomed, but the captain and several hundred volunteers remained aboard, fighting fires manually, jettisoning burning aircraft, flooding magazines before they exploded. For hours they fought, expecting at any moment for the ship to explode or capsize. Cruiser Pittsburgh took Franklin under tow, slowly pulling the burning carrier away from Japan, while friendly fighters drove off Japanese aircraft attempting to finish her. Franklin survived, the most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war. But her survival cost 832 casualties killed or wounded, an entire air group destroyed, months of repairs ahead. The episode revealed how vulnerable even modern carriers remained to determined attack. Franklin had been one of the newest, largest, most capable carriers in the fleet, and a single Japanese bomber had nearly destroyed her in seconds. If Japan could do this to one carrier with one bomber, what would happen at Okinawa, where kamikazes would attack in hundreds? By late March, Task Force 58 had been at sea for 92 consecutive days, longer than any naval force in history had maintained combat operations. The cumulative strain showed everywhere. Carriers needed maintenance that couldn't be performed at sea. Aircraft were reaching end of service life, wearing out from constant operations. And pilots were flying despite exhaustion, their performance declining from fatigue. Maintenance crews worked in zombie-like states, sustained by coffee and Benzedrine and willpower. Several near-collision incidents occurred because exhausted officers misjudged distances. The task force remained combat effective, but barely. Everyone needed rest. But Okinawa was next, the largest, most critical invasion yet, and Task Force 58 was the only force that could provide necessary air support. Mitscher himself was in alarming condition. His staff watched him constantly, fearing collapse. He had lost 30 pounds since assuming command, now weighed barely 125 pounds, looked skeletal. His hands shook continuously. He dozed standing on the bridge, sometimes swaying dangerously. The task force surgeon documented symptoms suggesting severe exhaustion, possible cardiac issues, but Mitscher refused relief. "After Okinawa," he told concerned staff officers. "We'll rest after Okinawa." But everyone privately wondered if Mitscher would survive Okinawa and whether Task Force 58 could function without him. The man who had revolutionized carrier warfare, who had transformed aviation from a naval backwater to the decisive weapon of the Pacific War, was literally working himself to death, and the war's deadliest operation was about to begin. April 6th, 1945, 0600. Radar operators across Task Force 58 watched their scopes fill with contacts approaching from the north. The count climbed continuously. 100 aircraft, 200, 300. One final tally, 355 Japanese aircraft inbound simultaneously, the largest kamikaze attack ever organized. This was Kikusui No. 1, the first of 10 massive attacks Japan would launch over the next 3 months. Admiral Ugaki, commanding the kamikaze forces, had committed every available aircraft to destroying the American fleet supporting Okinawa. The message was clear. Japan would sacrifice thousands of pilots and aircraft, if necessary, to drive American carriers from Japanese home waters. For Task Force 58, the nightmare scenario had arrived. Radar Picket Station 1, 50 miles northwest of Okinawa, directly between the Japanese airfields and Task Force 58. 4 destroyers occupied this station: USS Bush, Calhoun, Colhoun, and Cassin Young. Their mission was simple and terrible: detect approaching kamikazes, vector fighters to intercept, and if attackers penetrated that far, absorb the attacks themselves to protect the carriers. The destroyers' crews understood they were bait, deliberately positioned where kamikazes would find them. At 0715, the first kamikazes appeared on radar 40 miles out. The destroyers transmitted contact reports, vectored combat air patrol toward the threats, and prepared for impact. Bush took the first hit at 0800. A Zero crashed into her amidships, exploding below decks. The destroyer remained operational despite heavy damage, continued directing fighters, continued reporting. 10 minutes later, a second kamikaze hit Bush's stern, destroying her propulsion. Dead in the water, she became a stationary target for following attacks. Over the next 30 minutes, 3 more kamikazes crashed into Bush. Each impact brought more fires, more casualties, more damage beyond any damage control team's ability to manage. At 0940, Bush rolled over and sank. 94 sailors died. Nearby, Calhoun absorbed 4 kamikaze hits within 15 minutes and sank. Colhoun was hit 3 times, towed away burning, and scuttled later that day. In 40 minutes, 3 destroyers were sunk and 1 heavily damaged. But the radar pickets had done their job. They had detected the attack early, vectored fighters to optimal intercept positions, and absorbed dozens of kamikazes that might otherwise have reached carriers. Task Force 58, 30 miles south. They fought desperately as kamikazes penetrated the outer defensive zones. The sky filled with anti-aircraft fire, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers firing every gun simultaneously, creating a steel curtain through which attackers had to fly. Hellcat fighters dove into kamikaze formations, shooting down aircraft before they could attack, but sheer numbers overwhelmed defenses. Carrier Missouri, the battleship that would host Japan's surrender 4 months later, barely escaped when a kamikaze crashed 50 yards from her bridge, the aircraft's engine rolling across her deck. Carrier Enterprise was hit by a kamikaze that penetrated her flight deck, killing 14 sailors. Multiple destroyers and smaller ships were hit, some sunk, others damaged. The first Kikasui attack lasted 8 hours. At waves of attackers coming continuously from multiple directions, never giving defenders a moment's rest. By 1400 hours, the attack finally ended. Final tally: 355 Japanese aircraft participated, 185 were shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft fire, 136 broke off without attacking or got lost, 34 actually hit targets. A 10% success rate doesn't sound impressive until translated to results. 3 destroyers sunk, 7 ships seriously damaged, hundreds of casualties. And this was just Kikasui number 1. 9 more mass attacks would follow over the next 3 months. April 11th, Kikasui number 2. Task Force 58's flagship Bunker Hill, one of the newest Essex-class carriers, operating 70 miles east of Okinawa. Mitscher was on the flag bridge as always, watching the noon recovery when 2 kamikazes penetrated the combat air patrol by hiding in friendly aircraft patterns, then dove suddenly. Both hit Bunker Hill within 30 seconds. The first struck the flight deck, penetrating to the hangar where dozens of armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. The second hit moments later, its bomb penetrating multiple decks before exploding. The combination triggered massive fires, aviation fuel, bombs, rockets, all detonating in secondary explosions. 396 sailors and Marines died in minutes. Mitscher and his staff evacuated the burning flagship, transferring to Enterprise under fire while kamikazes still circled above. Bunker Hill survived but was out of the war, requiring 6 months of repairs. May 11th, in Enterprise, Mitscher's new flagship, hit by a kamikaze that crashed near the forward elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck. The explosion killed 14, wounded dozens more, knocked the forward elevator completely off its tracks, holding the flight deck with a 20-foot crater. Enterprise could no longer launch or recover aircraft. For the second time in 3 weeks, Mitscher had to transfer his flag under fire, now moving to USS New Mexico, a battleship. Task Force 58's commander had lost 2 flagships in 1 month, unprecedented in naval history. But the kamikaze campaign's strategic failure was becoming apparent. Japan had sunk or damaged dozens of ships, but hadn't stopped American operations. Okinawa's invasion continued despite kamikaze attacks. Carriers remained on stations despite losses. Even though the kamikazes inflicted horrible casualties, but couldn't achieve strategic objectives. The radar picket destroyers paid the war's highest price. Between April and June, 16 destroyers were sunk on picket duty, over 50 damaged. These losses dwarfed carrier losses. More destroyers were sunk, protecting carriers, than carriers themselves were sunk. The crews endured conditions beyond description. Hours of continuous alerts, kamikazes attacking repeatedly. No escape possible because leaving station meant kamikazes reaching carriers. Destroyer sailors watched aircraft approach, knowing some were friendly, some were kamikazes, unable to tell until the last seconds. The psychological strain was devastating. Some crews reached breaking points, firing at all aircraft indiscriminately. Courts-martial were quietly shelved. Command recognized these men were enduring impossible stress. Fighter pilot exhaustion became critical. Pilots flew 4 to 5 sorties daily for months. Takeoff, patrol, 4 hours, land, rearm, launch again. Sleep came in 4-hour shifts between missions. Stimulants kept them functional. Benzodrine tablets issued routinely. Coffee consumed by the gallon. Adrenaline providing brief clarity during combat. But sustained alertness was impossible. Pilots fell asleep in ready rooms between launches. Some fell asleep in their cockpits during patrol, waking when wingmen called warnings. Several accidents occurred from simple exhaustion. Landing gear left up, wrong carrier approached, controlled flight into water because the pilot dozed at the wrong moment. In May 28, Admiral Nimitz, now watching casualty reports from Pearl Harbor, made a painful decision: relieve Mitscher for medical reasons. Mitscher had commanded Task Force 58 for 18 months, longer than any carrier force commander in history, through more major operations than any admiral had ever conducted. He had lost 35 pounds, looked 20 years older than his age, showed clear signs of severe exhaustion and possible cardiac issues. The task force surgeon had been documenting symptoms for months, warning that Mitscher was approaching complete physical collapse. Nimitz sent orders. Mitscher would return to Pearl Harbor for rest and medical evaluation. Vice Admiral John McCain would assume command. Mitscher received the relief orders on the flag bridge of New Mexico, his 3rd flagship in 6 weeks, and showed no emotion. He had been expecting this, probably had been hoping for it despite never admitting it. But leaving Task Force 58 felt like abandonment. His pilots were still fighting, still dying, still needing his judgment and his care. Leaving them felt like betrayal, even though his body couldn't sustain command any longer. He drafted a brief message to the task force. "It has been an honor to command you in the greatest naval operations ever conducted. Fair winds." 17 words, more than he usually spoke in a week. Then he departed for the long flight to Pearl Harbor, leaving behind the carriers and pilots and operations that had consumed his life for 2 years. The Okinawa campaign continued through June, Kikosui attacks persisting until Japan ran out of aircraft. When fighting finally ended, the statistics were staggering. At 10 Kikosui mass attacks involving over 1,400 kamikaze sorties, 36 American ships sunk, 368 damaged, 4,900 American sailors killed, more than the entire Marine Corps death toll at Iwo Jima. Japanese losses, approximately 4,000 aircraft and pilots. The kamikaze campaign had inflicted terrible damage but failed strategically. American carriers remained on station. Okinawa was captured, and the invasion of Japan itself was being planned. The kamikazes had proven that even the most advanced carriers remained vulnerable to determined attack, but they had also proven that tactical success didn't guarantee strategic victory. Japan could kill American sailors by the thousands, but couldn't stop American operations. The divine wind had blown itself out against American industrial might and operational resilience. And Marc Mitscher, the admiral who had endured 800 consecutive days of combat command, had finally reached his breaking point. The quiet man who revolutionized carrier warfare was going home to rest. The question was whether he would survive the peace after barely surviving the war. Pearl Harbor, June 1945. Marc Mitscher climbed slowly down the aircraft stairs, moving like a much older man, and stepped onto Hawaiian soil for the first time in 19 months. He had commanded from carrier decks, battleship bridges, anywhere except stable ground. Now he was home, relieved of command, ordered to rest and recover. Staff officers who met him were shocked by his appearance. The admiral who had departed Pearl Harbor in January 1944 had been thin but vital, energetic despite his reticence. The man who returned looked skeletal, ancient, exhausted beyond description. His uniform hung loosely on a frame that had lost 40 pounds. His face was deeply lined, skin gray, eyes showing the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much. He moved carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might break something. This was what 18 months of combat command had done to the Navy's best carrier admiral. The medical examination was conducted immediately, and results alarmed even experienced Navy doctors. Severe exhaustion, malnutrition from sustained weight loss, possible myocardial ischemia, suggesting heart damage, chronic insomnia, as symptoms consistent with what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Blood pressure dangerously elevated, resting heart rate accelerated, hand tremors constant. The smoking, 6 packs of Camels daily for months, had damaged his lungs, causing chronic cough. The doctor's consensus was clear. Mitscher was on the edge of complete physical collapse. Had he continued commanding Task Force 58, he likely would have suffered a heart attack or stroke within weeks, possibly dying at his post. The relief orders had probably saved his life, but the psychological damage was harder to document and more concerning. Mitscher compulsively watched the sky, tracking aircraft overhead despite being hundreds of miles from combat. He woke from brief sleep sessions disoriented, looking for his bridge station, all taking minutes to realize he was in a hospital bed, not on a carrier. He asked repeatedly about Task Force 58, were operations continuing, were pilots being recovered, had any ships been lost. Staff officers reassured him that McCain was commanding competently, that operations were succeeding, that everything was fine. Mitscher nodded, but didn't seem convinced. His entire identity had become bound up in commanding Task Force 58, caring for those pilots, making decisions that kept them alive. Being separated from that responsibility left him adrift, purposeless. The medical staff discovered something troubling during Mitscher's recovery. He had personally reviewed every pilot loss report during his command, every single one, over 18 months. 734 pilots had been lost from Task Force 58 during Mitscher's tenure, killed in combat, in accidents, missing, and never recovered. Mitscher had read every report, studied circumstances of each loss, asked questions about whether anything could have been done differently. He knew the names of hundreds of dead pilots, had attended memorial services whenever possible, had written letters to families. The cumulative weight of those deaths, the knowledge that his decisions had sent those men to their deaths, even when the decisions were correct, had accumulated into crushing psychological burden. His wife Frances, arriving from the mainland, barely recognized her husband. They had been married 30 years, but the man who met her at Pearl Harbor seemed a stranger. He was physically diminished, certainly, but the deeper change was emotional. The Marc Mitscher she had married had been reserved, quiet, but present. The man who returned was haunted, distant, trapped somewhere between Pearl Harbor and the combat zones he had left behind. She tried engaging him in conversation about their home, their plans for after the war, anything normal. Mitscher responded minimally, his attention constantly wandering to radios broadcasting news from the Pacific, to newspapers reporting carrier operations, to the sky where aircraft flew overhead. He was physically present but mentally still commanding Task Force 58. June 23rd. Awards ceremony at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Nimitz presented Mitscher with a gold star in lieu of a third Distinguished Service Medal, recognizing his command of Task Force 58. The citation listed accomplishments: 54 major operations, 5,300 enemy aircraft destroyed, 400 enemy ships sunk, support for 6 amphibious invasions. The statistics were staggering. More destruction inflicted by one command in 18 months than most nations' entire military forces achieved in the war. Mitscher stood at attention while the citation was read, showing no emotion. When asked to speak, he stepped forward and said, "Thank you. My boys did this, not me." He spoke for exactly 90 seconds, the longest public speech anyone could remember him giving, then returned to his seat. His boys, the pilots he had commanded, had achieved everything. He had simply tried not to get them killed unnecessarily. the Navy faced a dilemma regarding Mitscher's future. He was clearly unfit for immediate return to command. The medical documentation was unambiguous. But he was also the Navy's most experienced carrier admiral, the officer who had developed most of Task Force 58's tactics and doctrine. The planned invasion of Japan would be the largest carrier operation ever, requiring coordination of dozens of carriers over months. Who could command such operations if not Mitscher? The Navy's solution was to place him on limited duty, keep him in Hawaii for medical observation and recovery, then potentially return him to command after sufficient rest. Mitscher accepted this arrangement without comment, though staff members suspected he was relieved to avoid immediate return to combat. July 1945, home leave finally approved. Admiral Mitscher returned to the United States for the first time in 3 years, traveling to his home in Norfolk. The quiet neighborhood seemed alien after years of carrier decks and combat operations. He struggled with civilian life's normalcy. Neighbors who welcomed him home mentioned losing sons in the war, thanking Mitscher for his service. He responded politely, but internally tormented by knowledge that he had sent other people's sons to their deaths, that his decisions had created the casualties these families mourned. Frances watched him grow increasingly withdrawn, spending hours alone, smoking constantly, sleeping little. She urged him to see doctors, to talk about his experiences, anything. Mitscher insisted he was fine, that he just needed time to adjust. But adjustment wasn't happening. Mitscher's sleep, he'd never good during combat command, deteriorated further. He had nightmares about burning carriers, about pilots calling for help he couldn't provide, about making decisions and watching aircraft crash. He woke Frances repeatedly, thrashing in his sleep, calling out orders in his characteristic terse style. During waking hours, he compulsively tracked news from the Pacific. Okinawa secured. Good. Japanese Air Force nearly destroyed. Good. Invasion of Japan planned for November. He should be there. His pilots would need him. The war was continuing without him, and he felt guilty for not being present. August 6th, atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. August 9th, atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Mitscher listened to the news with complex emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, that his pilots would come home alive, but also something darker, a feeling that his suffering had been rendered somewhat meaningless. The invasion he had been preparing for, the operation that would have required everything he had learned, would never happen. The atomic bombs had ended the war, and Task Force 58's role was now historical rather than ongoing. His entire purpose for the past 4 years had been preparing for operations that would never occur. The final statistics of Mitscher's combat command were compiled over following months. 548 consecutive days of combat responsibility from January 1944 to June 1945. 15 major operations commanded personally. Task Force. 58 under his command had destroyed over 6,000 Japanese aircraft, had sunk over 500 ships, supported 6 major amphibious invasions. American losses under his command: 734 pilots killed, 8 carriers damaged seriously enough to withdraw from combat, 16 destroyers sunk on radar picket duty. The exchange ratio was overwhelmingly in America's favor, but exchange ratios measured equipment and numbers, not the psychological cost of sending men to die day after day for 18 months. That cost showed in Mitscher's gaunt face, his shaking hands, his haunted eyes. He had achieved everything the Navy asked of him, and more. But the price had been nearly everything he had to give. The quiet man who revolutionized carrier warfare had broken himself doing it. And now, with the war over, the question was whether Marc Mitscher could survive the peace. July 10th, 1945, Admiral William Halsey assumed command of what was still called Task Force 38. The designation shifted depending on who commanded, and immediately ordered aggressive operations against the Japanese home islands. With Mitscher recovering stateside, Halsey brought his own command philosophy: maximum aggression, relentless pressure, no defensive thinking. The carriers would strike Japan's industrial heartland continuously until surrender or invasion, whichever came first. From his hospital bed in Norfolk, Mitscher read reports of these operations with mixed feelings. He was glad the war effort continued, but worried that Halsey's aggression might lead to unnecessary losses. Different commanders, different philosophies. Halsey believed in attacking everything attackable. Mitscher had believed in bringing his boys home. The operational tempo Halsey established made even Mitscher's sustained operations look measured. Carriers struck northern Honshu on July 10th, Hokkaido on July 14th, the Kanto Plain on July 16th. Every major Japanese city within carrier aircraft range was hit repeatedly. The strategic logic was clear. Destroy Japan's remaining industrial capacity before invasion. Eliminate any aircraft that might oppose the planned November landings. Demonstrate that nowhere in Japan was safe from attack. But the tactical reality was increasingly absurd. Japanese defenders had almost nothing left to resist with. Most aircraft had been expended in the kamikaze campaign. Most experienced pilots were dead. Factories were already damaged or destroyed by B-29 raids. The carriers were destroying what little remained of Japanese military capability. July 14th through 15. Task Force 38's most unusual operation, battleship bombardment of Kamaishi, a steel production city on northern Honshu. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American battleships approached close enough to Japanese soil to fire their main batteries at land targets. 9 battleships, including Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin, pumped 816-inch and 14-inch shells into Kamaishi's ironworks from 10 miles offshore. Carriers provided fighter cover, but Japanese response was negligible. The bombardment was less about military necessity than symbolism. American battleships, shelling Japan, demonstrating absolute control of Japanese waters. Everything had changed since 1941. July 24th, Kure Naval Base, Japan's largest remaining naval facility. Task Force 38 launched over 1,300 sorties over 2 days, systematically destroying the remnants of the Japanese Navy. Battleship Hyuga, hit by torpedoes and bombs, settled to the bottom in shallow water. Carrier Amagi capsized after taking 10 bomb hits. Carrier Katsuragi damaged beyond repair. Battleships Issei and Haruna both sunk at their moorings. Cruisers Tone, Aoba, Oyodo all destroyed. The Japanese Navy, which had dominated the Pacific 3 years earlier, ceased to exist. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had menaced the Pacific throughout 1942, that had represented Japan's naval might, all were now underwater or burning at dockside. The transformation was complete. American carriers had annihilated Japanese carriers, and in doing so, had proven their supremacy beyond any possible argument. But the continuing operations felt increasingly surreal to participants. Pilots flew missions encountering virtually no opposition, attacking targets already destroyed, bombing rubble. Japanese cities were burning from B-29 incendiary raids. The Navy couldn't land invasion forces without Army support, and invasion wasn't scheduled until November. What were the carriers accomplishing beyond adding to destruction? Some pilots questioned the purpose. Were they risking their lives bombing empty factories and already destroyed ships? Command provided no satisfying answers. The directive was to maintain pressure, demonstrate capability, prepare for invasion. So, operations continued. August 6th. News reached at Task Force 38 of something called an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Initial reports were confused. Claims of a single bomb destroying an entire city seemed impossible. But reconnaissance confirmed it. Hiroshima effectively obliterated by one weapon. Task Force 38 continued operations, launching strikes against Tokyo on August 8th. Pilots flew over the capital, seeing damage everywhere. Entire districts burned from previous raids, transportation paralyzed, visible evidence of a nation on the edge of collapse. But official surrender hadn't come yet, so the war continued. August 9th. Second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. August 13th, Task Force 38 launched final major strikes against Tokyo. At over 400 aircraft hit airfields and military installations around the capital. Japanese response was token. A handful of fighters intercepted, quickly shot down. The raids felt like formality, going through motions while everyone awaited the inevitable announcement. And then it came. August 15th, 1945, 0700, radio broadcast from Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito, announcing Japan's acceptance of surrender terms. The war was over. Task Force 38 was launching its morning strike, aircraft already airborne heading toward Tokyo. When the announcement came, emergency recalls were transmitted. All aircraft returned to base immediately. Hostilities ceased. Pilots in their cockpits received the message mid-flight, some already over Japan, weapons armed, ready to attack. They turned back toward the carriers, some crying, some cheering, some simply stunned. After 3 years, 8 months, and 8 days of Pacific War, it was finished. The carriers that had fought across the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo, now steamed into Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony. On September 2nd, 1945, Japanese representatives signed surrender documents aboard battleship Missouri, while 1,200 carrier aircrafts flew overhead in massive formation. The symbolism was deliberate. Missouri hosted the ceremony, but carriers had won the war. The aircraft circling above represented the weapon that had defeated Japan, the revolution in warfare that had transformed naval combat fundamentally. Battleship admirals had been proven wrong about everything. Carrier advocates had been vindicated completely. And Marc Mitscher, the mediocre student who became naval aviation's greatest commander, watched from Norfolk, Virginia, as the war ended without him. Mitscher's feelings about missing the surrender were complex and never fully expressed. He had commanded more carrier operations than anyone, had developed the tactics and doctrine that led to victory, had sacrificed his health and nearly his life in those commands. But when final victory came, when the Emperor surrendered, when the war ended, Mitscher was thousands of miles away, medically unfit for duty, watching history happen in newsreels rather than participating personally. Staff members who visited him in Norfolk reported he seemed relieved the war was over, but also melancholic about his absence. The quiet man remained quiet about his feelings. The post-war assessment of carrier aviation's role was unambiguous. Carriers had been the decisive weapon of the Pacific War. They had destroyed the Japanese fleet at Midway and the Philippine Sea. They had supported every major amphibious invasion from Tarawa to Okinawa. They had struck Tokyo itself repeatedly, demonstrating Japan's vulnerability. The battleship era was over. Most battleships were headed for mothballs, while carriers continued operations. The statistics supported this conclusion overwhelmingly. Carriers had sunk over 1,300 enemy ships, destroyed 8,500 enemy aircraft, and made possible every Allied advance across the Pacific. Industrial production had provided the weapons, but tactical innovation had made them decisive. And tactical innovation had been led primarily by one man, the silent admiral who cared more about his pilots than his own survival, who stood on bridges watching aircraft for 800 consecutive days, who revolutionized warfare while barely speaking. Marc Mitscher had earned his place in history. The question was what peace would do to a man defined entirely by war. Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945. The surrender ceremony aboard Missouri lasted 30 minutes, signatures exchanged, speeches delivered, photographs taken. But the 1,200 carrier aircraft circling overhead told the real story. Those aircraft, launched from 15 carriers steaming in Tokyo Bay, represented more striking power than most nations possessed in their entire military. They flew in perfect formation, demonstrating the coordination and discipline that had been developed through 3 years of brutal warfare. Japanese officers watching from Missouri's deck saw the aircraft and understood. This was why they had lost. Not because of atomic bombs, not because of American industry alone, but because American carrier aviation had become an unstoppable force that could project power anywhere, destroy anything, and sustain operations indefinitely. The Naval War College began immediate post-war analysis, assembling data from every carrier operation, producing reports that would guide naval doctrine for generations. The statistics were staggering in their totality. American carriers had conducted 171,800 sorties during the Pacific War. They had destroyed 8,500 enemy aircraft in air combat. They had sunk 1,300 enemy ships totaling nearly 6 million tons. They had supported 18 major amphibious operations, They had operated continuously for periods exceeding 3 months multiple times. The exchange ratios favored America overwhelmingly. 10 enemy aircraft destroyed for every American aircraft lost, 20 enemy ships sunk for every carrier damaged, 50 enemy pilots killed for every American pilot killed. Carrier aviation hadn't just won the Pacific War, it had won decisively, demonstrably, irrefutably. But what made this revolution succeed where previous military innovations had failed? The analysis identified several factors. First, industrial capacity. America built 141 carriers of all types during the war, while Japan built 25. Second, Navy training infrastructure. American pilot training produced 437,000 naval aviators by 1945, compared to barely 30,000 in 1941. Third, tactical innovation. Concepts like deck load strikes, big blue blanket, radar fighter direction, underway replenishment, transformed carriers from vulnerable platforms into dominant weapons. Fourth, operational doctrine. Fast carrier task force concept allowed concentration of overwhelming force at decisive points. Fifth, leadership. Commanders like Mitscher, who understood carriers, instinctively made decisions that maximized effectiveness while minimizing losses. November 1945. Japanese perspective. Vice Admiral Takejiro Ozawa, who had commanded Japanese carriers at Philippine Sea, gave extensive interviews to American naval intelligence. His assessment was brutally honest. We learned the lessons of carrier warfare too late and could never match American industrial production. By 1944, every pilot we trained had less experience than the Americans. Every carrier we built was immediately outnumbered. Every operation we conducted faced overwhelming opposition. The war became mathematically unwinnable once America's carrier production reached full capacity. Ozawa noted that Japan's decision to build super battleships Yamato and Musashi instead of more carriers had been catastrophic strategic error, 2 battleships costing the same as 6 carriers, but achieving nothing except their own destruction. Norfolk Navy Yard, January 1946. Battleships Iowa, New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Missouri entered mothballs, their crews transferred to carriers or discharged. The symbolism was unmistakable. The Navy's future was aviation, not gun-armed capital ships. Several battleships would remain in service, providing anti-aircraft protection for carriers, but their role had been permanently reduced to supporting cast. The carriers they protected continued operations, their missions shifting from combat to peacetime presence operations. Essex-class carriers would serve for decades, some through the Vietnam War, proving the design's longevity. The revolution that began with converted Collier Langley in 1922 had reached its conclusion with Essex-class carriers dominating every ocean. But hidden in the statistics was a darker cost that few analysts acknowledged. The personnel transformation from pre-war to post-war was as dramatic as the technological transformation. Naval aviation grew from 5,500 personnel in 1941 to 437,000 by 1945, an 80-fold increase. Those personnel operated at intensity levels that proved unsustainable psychologically. Post-war medical studies documented alarming rates of what was then called combat fatigue among carrier veterans. Insomnia, nightmares, hypervigilance, emotional numbing. The symptoms would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. But in 1946, the Navy simply discharged affected personnel and moved on. Carrier commanders suffered disproportionately. Average tenure commanding a carrier or carrier task force during combat was 6.3 months before death, relief, or rotation. Only Mitscher exceeded a year, and his physical and psychological breakdown demonstrated why longer tenures were impossible. Several carrier commanders died of heart attacks within months of war's end, their systems failing after sustained stress ended. The Navy never systematically studied the relationship between command responsibility and mortality, but informal analysis suggested carrier command reduced life expectancy by years. The tactical validation was absolute. Every innovation Mitscher and others developed proved correct under combat conditions. Deck load strikes maximized attack weight while minimizing enemy reaction time, validated in every major operation from Truk onward. As Big Blue Blanket suppressed enemy airfields continuously, enabled operations near Japanese home islands, despite massive Japanese air presence. Radar fighter direction created defensive systems able to intercept attackers 50 miles from the task force. Neutralized kamikaze threats sufficiently to sustain operations. Life jacket submarines and aggressive air-sea rescue saved 86% of downed pilots, preserving experience and maintaining morale. Combat air patrol doctrine with layered defensive zones enabled carriers to operate in threat environments that should have been suicidal. The cost-effectiveness analysis was equally compelling. An Essex-class carrier cost $68 million and could deliver 100 aircraft to targets 800 miles away. An Iowa-class battleship cost $110 million and could hit targets 25 miles away. The carrier cost 60% as much and had 30 times the range and far more flexibility in the target selection. Building carriers instead of battleships had been the correct strategic choice, proven by every operation from Midway onward. The battleship admirals who fought carrier funding in the 1930s had been wrong, not just tactically, but economically. But perhaps the most significant validation was doctrinal. Before World War II, carriers were considered auxiliary vessels supporting the battleship fleet. By 1945, carriers were the fleet, and everything else supported them. And this inversion of doctrine had happened incredibly rapidly, barely 3 years from Pearl Harbor to Philippine Sea, and represented one of history's fastest major transitions in military thinking. That the transition succeeded, despite intense bureaucratic resistance, testified to the overwhelming evidence that carriers worked. Reality had forced doctrine to change, and the Navy had changed just quickly enough to win. Marc Mitscher's contribution to this revolution was difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss. He hadn't invented carrier aviation. That credit belonged to pioneers like Moffett and Towers. He hadn't designed the Essex-class carriers or the aircraft they flew. He hadn't made strategic decisions about Pacific War strategy. That was Nimitz and MacArthur. But Mitscher had commanded the Fast Carrier Task Force longer than anyone else, developed more tactical innovations than any other commander, and achieved results that validated every aspect of carrier doctrine. Without Mitscher, someone else would have commanded Task Force 58. But whether that alternative commander would have been as successful, whether they would have developed the same innovations, whether they would have achieved similar results with similar casualties, those questions were unanswerable but significant. The quiet man had shaped carrier warfare's development at exactly the moment when its form was being determined. His influence would persist for decades. Washington, D.C., March 1946. Admiral Marc Andrew Mitscher stood in full-dress uniform at the Department of the Navy, forward receiving his 4th Distinguished Service Medal and promotion to 4-star Admiral. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal read the citation aloud. Exceptional leadership, tactical brilliance, inspirational command, decisive contribution to victory in the Pacific. The gathered admirals and dignitaries applauded. Photographers captured the moment. Mitscher stood at attention, expressionless as always, accepting honors with the same silence he brought to everything. When asked to speak, he stepped forward and said simply, "Thank you. I was privileged to serve with the finest sailors and pilots in the world." 43 words. Then he returned to his seat. Even at his moment of greatest recognition, Marc Mitscher remained the man who let his actions speak. But the honors couldn't disguise the visible damage 18 months of combat command had inflicted. Mitscher looked 20 years older than his 59 years. His face was gaunt, deeply lined, skin pallid. His hands shook noticeably, even when holding them clasped. His eyes showed the distant look of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere, probably on a carrier bridge somewhere in the Pacific, watching aircraft that no longer flew. Medical examinations continued showing concerning signs: elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, damage to cardiovascular system consistent with prolonged stress. The doctors recommended extended rest, reduced duties, careful monitoring. Mitscher accepted these recommendations with characteristic stoicism, though privately he seemed resigned to permanent diminishment. Atlantic Fleet Command, in 1946 through 1947. The Navy assigned Mitscher to command 8th Fleet, a peacetime position that should have been prestigious but felt like exile. His command consisted of carriers conducting training operations, showing the flag at various ports, routine peacetime Navy activities. Nothing challenging, nothing urgent, nothing that required the intense focus and tactical genius he had brought to Pacific operations. Subordinates noticed Mitscher seemed diminished, going through motions without the energy that had characterized his wartime command. He attended meetings, signed documents, made required appearances, all with visible effort. The fire that had sustained him through 18 months of combat had burned out, leaving only ash. His physical condition deteriorated steadily. Yet the smoking continued, 4 packs daily, despite doctors' warnings. Sleep remained disturbed, nightmares persistent, insomnia chronic. Weight stabilized around 135 pounds, below healthy range for his height. He began experiencing chest pains during exertion, initially dismissed as indigestion, but increasingly concerning. Francis urged him to retire, to seek proper medical care, to prioritize his health over naval service. Mitscher considered retirement, but seemed unable to commit. The Navy had been his life for 40 years. What would he be without it? February 3rd, 1947. Norfolk, Virginia. Admiral Marc A. Mitscher suffered a massive heart attack at his desk while reviewing routine correspondence. His aide found him collapsed, called for medical assistance immediately. 9 Navy doctors worked desperately to stabilize him, but the damage was catastrophic. Mitscher never regained consciousness. At 1700 hours, he was pronounced dead. Age 60, serving in a desk position that required virtually no exertion. The cause of death was officially listed as myocardial infarction, but everyone who had known him understood the real cause. Mitscher had been killed by the war, just more slowly than if a kamikaze had hit his flagship. The 18 months of combat command, the sleepless nights, the stress of sending men to their deaths, the physical exhaustion, the psychological burden, all of it had accumulated into damage his body couldn't survive. The funeral at Arlington National Cemetery drew enormous attendance. 500 pilots who had served under Mitscher came from across the country, standing silent witness as their admiral was laid to rest. Naval leadership attended in full force. Nimitz, Halsey, Spruance, King, all the admirals who had shaped Pacific war strategy. But the pilots were Mitscher's real mourners. He had cared about them in ways no other admiral had, prioritized their survival even when it cost him opportunities for glory, brought them home when other commanders might have written them off. They remembered him standing on the bridge watching every launch and recovery, ordering the task force lit up to guide them home, personally briefing them before dangerous missions. They remembered his silence, his baseball cap worn backwards, his chain smoking, his complete indifference to anything except their safety and success. The irony of his death wasn't lost on anyone who had served with him. That Mitscher survived hundreds of combat operations, escaped 2 burning flagships, endured kamikaze attacks that killed thousands around him, only to die behind a desk in peacetime. He had given everything to winning the war and had nothing left when the war ended. His life expectancy had been shortened by years. Actuarial analysis suggested carrier force commanders during combat died on average 15 years younger than their peacetime counterparts. The stress of command had literal physiological costs that medical science was only beginning to understand. But Mitscher's legacy extended far beyond his personal story. Every tactical innovation he developed remained standard doctrine in the post-war Navy. Combat air patrol procedures, radar fighter direction, underway replenishment, its aggressive air-sea rescue, all became institutionalized in carrier operations manuals. Training curricula incorporated lessons learned from Task Force 58 operations. The carrier-centric fleet organization Mitscher had commanded became the Navy's permanent structure. Young officers studying at the Naval War College analyzed his operations, learning from his decisions, understanding how he had coordinated complex strikes while maintaining pilot-first philosophy. USS Mitscher, Die DG-57, commissioned in 1994, carried his name forward. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer operated as part of carrier strike groups, providing anti-aircraft defense. The radar picket mission evolved and modernized. The ship's commissioning ceremony featured surviving pilots from Task Force 58, now elderly men, sharing stories of serving under the Admiral who had changed their lives. They spoke of his silence, his care, his absolute dedication to bringing them home. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by modern carrier aircraft, Super Hornets that could carry more ordnance farther than entire strike groups from Mitscher's era, but still operating according to doctrine he had developed. Modern carrier operations, 7 decades after World War II, still reflect Mitscher's influence. Carrier strike groups still emphasize layered air defense zones. Fighter direction still prioritizes early intercept of threats. Air-sea rescue remains paramount. No pilot left behind if recovery is remotely possible. The principle of decentralized execution under centralized command, letting subordinate commanders execute missions while providing clear intent, traces directly to Mitscher's leadership style. Even physical traditions persist. Baseball caps remain authorized headgear on carrier bridges, partly because Mitscher made them iconic. But perhaps the most important legacy is less tangible, the understanding that carrier warfare requires specific command qualities. Technical competence is necessary, but insufficient. Commanding carriers requires ability to process enormous amounts of information quickly, make decisions with incomplete data, accept responsibility for casualties, maintain composure under stress, inspire trust in subordinates, and sustain operations for extended periods. Few officers possess all these qualities simultaneously. Mitscher did, and his example established standards for carrier force commanders that persist today. The cost of achieving those standards remains controversial. Should the Navy have rotated Mitscher out of command earlier, preventing his physical breakdown? Should operational tempo have been reduced to protect commanders' health? Were the innovations Mitscher developed worth the price he personally paid? These questions have no clear answers. The Navy won the Pacific War decisively using methods Mitscher pioneered, but Mitscher himself died at 60, worn out by the war, his potential contributions to peacetime naval development lost. The trade-off between wartime effectiveness and commander welfare remains unresolved in military doctrine. What distinguished Mitscher from competent commanders was his ability to balance seemingly contradictory requirements. He was aggressive but not reckless, cautious but not timid, innovative but not experimental, demanding but not unreasonable. He maximized offensive power while minimizing casualties. He coordinated complex operations while maintaining clear command structure. He inspired loyalty without cultivating personality cult. He achieved results without self-promotion. These balanced qualities, neither extreme aggression nor excessive caution, defined his command effectiveness. The quiet man who barely spoke left a legacy written in actions rather than words. He commanded the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled and used it to win decisive victories while prioritizing his subordinates' survival. He developed tactical innovations that became standard doctrine. He demonstrated that carrier aviation could project power globally, decisively, sustainably. He proved that silent leadership through presence and example could be more effective than inspirational speeches. And he did all this while destroying himself physically and psychologically through absolute dedication to duty. Marc Andrew Mitscher didn't just revolutionize carrier warfare. He defined what command excellence looked like in the modern Navy. That definition endures, inspiration and cautionary tale simultaneously, showing both what is possible and what it costs to achieve the impossible.